Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've always been comfortable in the wilderness. My dad was a park ranger before me, and my earliest memories are of following him through dense woods, the crunch of leaves under our boots and the hum of nature all around. That's why I took the night shifts. I liked the solitude, the quiet. But one night changed everything, and now I can't hear foghorns or a woman's voice without my stomach turning inside out. It was a Tuesday, sometime in late October, when the fog rolled in like a blanket across the woods, thick, milky mist that swallowed sound and turned the world into something alien. It crept up from the river, turning the trees into tall, indistinct shapes, their branches like skeletal hands reaching into the haze. I'd seen fog plenty of times, but not like this. It was a different kind of quiet, the sort that clung to the air and made the hairs on your neck prickle. I was making my rounds along the Ridgeway Trail, a narrow path that hugged the river, with my flashlight barely cutting through the mist. The radio in my truck was silent, just static. No one else out there tonight. I was alone, just how I liked it. The crunch of my boots on the gravel was the only sound in that muffled world, and it felt strangely amplified, like each step echoed in a void. That's when I heard it. A voice. A woman's voice, faint, carried on the breeze through the mist. I stopped dead, the sound cutting through my thoughts like a blade. Help. Please. My flashlight swept through the fog, but all I saw were shifting shadows. My first thought was that it must be one of the hikers who had gotten lost or hurt. This part of the trail was known for twisting back on itself, especially when visibility was low. It wasn't uncommon for someone to wander off the path and need assistance. But as I scanned the woods, I couldn't see anything, just the pale blur of trees melting into the mist. "Hello?" I called out, raising my voice. "This is Ranger John Harris. Where are you?" There was no reply. I strained my ears, but only the soft rustle of wind through the leaves answered. I waited, listening, my breath clouding the air in front of me. Maybe I had imagined it. The fog did strange things to sound, distorting it, bouncing it around, but then it came again, a little closer this time. "Help! I'm lost." There was no mistaking it now. I felt a tight knot of urgency form in my chest, the kind that overrides everything else. I turned toward the direction of the voice and started walking, leaving the trail behind. My flashlight cut a weak path through the trees, but the fog was so dense that it seemed to swallow the beam just a few feet ahead of me. Branches scraped against my arms as I pushed through the undergrowth, the voice always just ahead, just out of sight. "I'm coming!" I shouted, trying to sound calm and reassuring, but the fog made my words feel small and thin. "Keep talking so I can find you." The voice didn't reply, but I could still hear it moving, a distant murmur that drifted through the trees. I followed it deeper into the woods, past familiar landmarks that became unfamiliar under the shroud of mist. My sense of direction started to waver, but I pressed on, using my compass to keep my bearings. Every so often, I'd hear the voice again, always that same pleading tone, but never quite clear enough to pinpoint. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into a clearing where the ground sloped down to the river. The fog thinned slightly here, revealing the murky water lapping against the shore. I stopped, shining my flashlight in a wide arc across the trees and water. "Where are you?" I called out, louder this time, my voice echoing across the water. Silence. My heart thudded in my chest, louder than the wind rustling through the trees. I stood there, flashlight trembling in my hand, waiting for an answer that never came. The chill in the air crept into my bones, and my mind began to race with possibilities. What if she had fallen into the river? What if she was unconscious or worse? And then, just as I was about to turn back and call for backup, I saw them, Footprints. Deep, heavy impressions in the mud near the water's edge, much larger than any boot print I'd ever seen. They led down from the tree line and disappeared into the river, like something or someone had walked straight into the water without hesitation, but there was no sign of a struggle, no sign of anyone at all. My breath caught in my throat. The prints were strange, too big, almost, and spaced wide like whatever made them had a long stride. But more than that, they felt wrong, somehow. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but a cold knot twisted in my gut as I stared at those marks. And then I heard it again, closer now, a whisper just behind me. "Help, please!" I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the mist, but there was no one there, just trees, their bark slick with dew, and shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. The fog was thicker now, rolling in off the river like it had a mind of its own, enveloping the clearing. My own breath sounded loud in my ears, and for the first time in a long while, I felt unsettled. Like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, and one wrong move would send me tumbling into darkness. I took a step back, away from the water, my boots squelching in the mud. My flashlight flickered, a brief, stuttering flash of darkness, and in that heartbeat of time, I saw it, just a shape, barely more than a shadow in the fog, tall and broad, standing on the opposite shore of the river. A figure, watching me. I froze. The light steadied again, and the shape was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained, prickling the back of my neck. My mind scrambled for explanations. Another hiker, a trick of the light, my own nerves, but none of them felt right. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet, the way it does when a predator is near. With a shaky breath, I turned back toward the way I'd come, following my own trail of footprints. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, to put distance between myself and whatever had left those tracks. But the fog seemed thicker now, twisting the trees into unfamiliar shapes, turning every shadow into something watching, waiting. And then I heard it, footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate, crushing twigs underfoot. They didn't sound human, too slow, too methodical. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder, but all I saw was mist swirling around the trees. My radio crackled to life at my hip, a burst of static that nearly made me jump out of my skin. For a second, I thought I caught a voice in the static, a woman's voice, whispering, before it faded back into the hiss of dead air. I fumbled with the dial, trying to call in my position, but all I got was more static. The footsteps stopped. My own breath was ragged, clouding the air in front of me. I stood there, turning slowly in a circle, flashlight sweeping the fog, but there was nothing. No movement, no shadow, just the faint whisper of the river behind me. I don't know how long I stood like that, heart hammering in my chest, before I heard it. Not a voice this time, but a low, deep sound, almost like a growl, rumbling from the trees to my left. I pointed my flashlight in that direction, but the beam cut through nothing but grey mist. I knew then that whatever was out there, it wasn't human. It was something else, something I didn't want to understand. I ran like I hadn't in years, my legs pumping through the underbrush, branches slapping against my face, breath burning in my lungs. The footsteps followed me, always just a little too close, thudding against the ground like they were made of something heavy. I didn't dare look back. Every instinct in me screamed to keep moving, to get back to the safety of my truck and the radio that might actually work. When I finally broke through the tree line and saw the glow of my truck's headlights through the mist, I almost sobbed with relief. I threw myself into the cab, slamming the door behind me, fumbling for the keys. As the engine roared to life, I saw a shadow move at the edge of the headlights, tall, broad, but gone in an instant. I didn't wait to see more. I sped down the gravel road, the tires skidding in the mud, leaving the mist and the clearing behind me. It wasn't until I was miles away that I allowed myself to breathe again, to glance in the rearview mirror. The road was empty, just a pale ribbon disappearing into darkness. But as I turned back to face the road, I thought I saw something, just a glimpse, a shadow moving between the trees, watching. I never found any trace of the woman, no missing person report, no hiker out of place. But every time I close my eyes, I still hear her voice whispering through the fog, pulling me back to that night. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the mist rolls in, I think I see a shadow at the edge of the woods, waiting. Story 2. I've been a forest ranger for over 2 decades, but nothing could have prepared me for that night. The scream that pierced the darkness wasn't like anything I'd heard before, not quite human, not quite animal. It sent a chill down my spine that no amount of experience could shake off. My name is Sarah Larson, and I've spent most of my adult life patrolling the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. I've encountered my fair share of wildlife, from curious black bears to elusive mountain lions. I thought I knew every sound these woods could produce. I was wrong. It was a crisp autumn night, the kind where your breath fogs in front of you and the stars seem close enough to touch. I was on my usual night patrol, flashlight in hand, senses alert for any signs of campers in restricted areas or wildlife in distress. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. Even the nocturnal creatures seemed to be holding their breath. That's when I heard it. A scream that started low and guttural before rising to a pitch that made my skin crawl. It echoed through the trees, bouncing off the ancient trunks and reverberating in my chest. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the radio at my belt. But I didn't call it in. Not yet. I needed to investigate first. I swept my flashlight in a wide arc, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. Nothing, just the familiar shapes of trees and underbrush. But something felt off. The air seemed heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. Taking a deep breath, I started walking towards where I thought the sound had come from. My boots crunched on the fallen leaves, each step sounding impossibly loud in the eerie silence that had fallen over the forest. I kept my movements slow and deliberate, years of training kicking in, despite the fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. As I approached a small clearing, my flashlight beam caught something on the ground. I crouched down, my heart racing as I examined what I'd found. Footprints. But these weren't from any animal I recognized. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own boot, with distinct toe marks that looked almost human-like. But that was impossible. Nothing human could leave prints like these. I traced the outline with my finger, feeling the depth of the impression. Whatever had made these was heavy, far heavier than a man. And they were fresh. The edges were crisp, undisturbed by wind or wildlife. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I realized what this meant. Whatever had made that scream, whatever had left these prints, it was still nearby. I stood up slowly, my eyes scanning the tree line. The shadows seemed deeper now, more menacing. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch made me jump. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was a hoax, some campers playing a prank. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. This was something else entirely. I decided to follow the tracks. It went against every instinct I had, every protocol I'd been taught. But I couldn't let this go. I needed to know what was out there. The tracks led deeper into the forest, away from the main trails and into areas I rarely patrolled. The undergrowth got thicker, the trees older and more gnarled. It felt like stepping into a primeval world, one where ancient things still roamed. As I pushed through a particularly dense thicket, I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I whirled around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the trees, and for a split second I saw it, a pair of eyes, reflecting the light like twin amber moons. They were set high, much higher than any known predator in these woods. I caught a glimpse of a massive, shadowy form before it melted back into the darkness with surprising speed for its size. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I fumbled for my radio, my hands shaking as I tried to call for backup, but all I got was static. I was on my own. I knew I should leave, to get out of there and report what I'd seen, but something kept me rooted to the spot, a mixture of fear and fascination that I couldn't shake. I'd spent my entire career in these woods, and I'd never encountered anything like this. That's when I heard it, the crack of a branch breaking behind me. It was close, too close. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and there it was. I couldn't make out details in the dim light, but what I saw was enough to make my blood run cold. It was tall, impossibly tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb the light. Its eyes glowed with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware. This wasn't just an animal, it was something more. For a moment, we stared at each other. I felt like a rabbit caught in the gaze of a wolf, frozen by a primal fear I'd never experienced before. My mind raced, trying to categorize what I was seeing. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the legends of the Pacific Northwest that I'd always dismissed as campfire stories suddenly seemed all too real. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. With a speed that defied its size, it turned and vanished into the underbrush. The forest erupted into a cacophony of breaking branches and rustling leaves as it fled. I stood there, my flashlight beam shaking as I tried to process what I'd just seen. Part of me wanted to follow, to chase down this impossible creature and prove to myself that it was real. But the rational part of my brain, the part that had kept me alive in the wilderness for all these years, held me back. Slowly, I began to back away, keeping my eyes on the spot where the creature had disappeared. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. A voice came through, distorted but recognizable as my colleague, John. "Sarah? Sarah, do you copy? We've had reports of strange noises in your sector. Everything okay out there?" I hesitated, my finger hovering over the talk button. What could I say? That I'd just had an encounter with a creature that shouldn't exist, that all the myths and legends about monsters in the woods might actually be true. "I'm fine," I finally responded, my voice steadier than I felt. Just checking out some unusual tracks. "I'll fill you in when I get back to the station." "Roger that," John replied. "Be careful out there." As I made my way back to my vehicle, my mind raced with questions. What had I just seen? Was it real, or had the darkness and isolation played tricks on my mind? And if it was real, what did that mean for everything I thought I knew about these forests? One thing was certain. This night had changed everything. The woods I'd thought I knew so well suddenly felt alien and mysterious. Every shadow held the potential for the impossible, and I knew, deep down, that I would never look at these forests the same way again. As I drove back to the ranger station, the first light of dawn was starting to break over the horizon. The familiar landscape looked different now, filled with secrets and possibilities I'd never considered before. I didn't know what I was going to tell my colleagues, or if I would tell them anything at all. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? But I knew one thing for certain: I would be back. Whatever I had encountered out there in the darkness, whatever impossible creature called these woods home, I needed to know more. The scientist in me demanded answers, even as the primal part of my brain screamed warnings. As I pulled into the station parking lot, I made a decision. I would keep this to myself. For now, I needed time to process what I'd seen, to gather evidence, to make sense of the impossible. But I would be watching, waiting for another chance to glimpse the creature that had shattered my understanding of the world. The forest had always been my home, my place of work, my sanctuary. Now it was something more, a place of mystery, of danger, of the unknown. And as I stepped out of my vehicle, the rising sun warming my face, I felt a mix of fear and excitement for what future nights in the forest might bring. Whatever was out there, whatever I had seen, I knew one thing for certain: the echoes of that night would stay with me forever, calling me back into the dark heart of the forest, where ancient secrets still lurked in the shadows. Story 3. We found the cabin just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the last slivers of daylight bleeding through the trees. Emily thought it was a great find, a place to shelter from the wind and cold. Me, I had my reservations. There's something about a place long abandoned, the way it sits in the woods like a forgotten tomb, that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. But she smiled, said it'd be fun, and I went along with it. I always do. We had been hiking all day, my sister and I, on a trail that wound through a dense forest in the Appalachian foothills. The air had turned colder, and the sky had shifted from gold to steel, signaling that we'd better find somewhere to make camp. That's when we stumbled upon it, a run-down cabin, half hidden behind a thick curtain of pine trees. The roof sagged, the wooden boards were weather-beaten, but it looked like it could keep the wind off our backs for the night. "See, it's perfect, Mike," Emily said, pulling me by the arm toward the front door. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and despite the unease gnawing at my gut, I couldn't help but smile. The floorboards creaked under our weight as we stepped inside, and dust motes danced in the air like tiny ghosts. The place smelled of mildew and age, and the air inside was stale, but it was warmer than outside. I used my flashlight to sweep over the room, a single space with a rusted wood stove in the corner, a rickety table, and a broken chair. There were no windows, just gaps in the wooden walls where the cold air seeped in. "I'll set up the sleeping bags. You can get the fire going," Emily said, dropping her pack onto the dusty floor. She moved around the room, humming to herself, oblivious to the way the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. I tried to shake off the unease, focusing on gathering dry wood and kindling from the area outside. It took a while, but I managed to coax a small flame into life in the stove, the crackling fire filling the cabin with a dim, flickering glow. As we settled in, the wind picked up outside, howling through the gaps in the cabin walls. The firelight cast long shadows that flickered and danced, making the room seem even smaller, more claustrophobic. We ate our dinner, peanut butter sandwiches and trail mix, while the sound of the wind filled the silence between us. "This place is pretty cool, right?" Emily said, her voice too loud in the quiet. She had that look in her eye, the one she always got when she was itching for an adventure, like something out of a ghost story. "Yeah, sure," I replied, forcing a smile, "but let's hope it's not haunted, okay?" Emily laughed, but her laughter sounded hollow, swallowed up by the darkness around us. I tried to keep the mood light, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. It was like the shadows had eyes, lurking in the corners where the firelight couldn't reach. We laid out our sleeping bags near the stove, and Emily slipped into hers, her eyes already drooping with exhaustion. I sat up a while longer, listening to the wind battering the cabin, the old boards groaning in protest. I must have drifted off at some point, but it wasn't a restful sleep. I kept waking up, heart pounding, convinced I'd heard something, a creak, a whisper, a breath too close to my ear. Sometime past midnight, I woke to a sound that I couldn't ignore, a soft thud, like something or someone moving outside the cabin. I froze, straining to listen. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow, barely enough to see by. Emily was still asleep beside me, her breath slow and steady. But outside, something scraped against the cabin walls, a slow, deliberate sound that made my blood run cold. I grabbed my flashlight and edged toward the door, moving as quietly as I could. My hand trembled as I turned the knob, easing the door open just enough to peer out. The fog had rolled in, thick and impenetrable, making the trees look like twisted silhouettes. The beam of my flashlight cut through it in a narrow path, but I couldn't see anything beyond a few feet, probably just an animal. I whispered to myself, trying to steady my nerves. But deep down, I knew that no animal I'd ever heard moved like that. So slow, so purposeful. I shut the door, turned back toward the room, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, tall and hunched. It moved past the window, or rather, the place where a window used to be. Just a gap in the boards, letting in slivers of moonlight through the fog. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. It was there, just for a moment, then gone again into the mist. I swallowed hard, turning off the flashlight to let my eyes adjust to the darkness. The fire's glow pulsed weakly, casting shadows that seemed to writhe across the walls. My mind raced with rational explanations. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or a deer brushing past the cabin. But my gut told me something else, something I didn't want to believe. Then Emily's voice cut through the silence, small and groggy. "Mike, did you hear that?" I glanced at her. She was sitting up in her sleeping bag, her face half lit by the dying fire. She looked so young, so vulnerable, and I suddenly regretted bringing her out here. "Yeah, I heard it," I said, keeping my voice low. "Stay here. I'll check it out." She nodded, her eyes wide, and I slipped outside again, flashlight in hand. I moved slowly, keeping my back to the cabin as I scanned the trees. The mist was thicker now, swirling around my feet, and the air felt colder, like it had dropped several degrees in the past hour. That's when I saw them. Scratches. Deep gouges in the wooden planks of the cabin's side, like something with claws had raked through it. My heart skipped a beat, and I crouched down to get a closer look. The marks were fresh, the wood splintered and raw. Whatever had made them, it wasn't small. My mind raced. Could it be a bear? But no, bears don't scratch like this. They don't leave clean parallel lines. I shone the flashlight back toward the trees, and for a moment I thought I saw movement, a shadow shifting in the fog, slipping between the trunks. Suddenly, a low rumble filled the air, like a growl carried on the wind. My blood turned to ice, and I backed up toward the door, heart hammering in my chest. Now? I grabbed our gear, stuffing sleeping bags into our packs with shaking hands, but Emily just stood there, her gaze fixed on the dark opening in the wall. I pulled her toward the door, trying to keep my voice calm. "Come on, we're going back to the car." Just as we reached the door, I heard it again, that same slow, dragging scrape against the side of the cabin, like something testing the walls. My heart pounded in my ears, and I swung the flashlight toward the sound, but saw nothing, just the swirling mist, thick and impenetrable. We stepped outside, and that's when I felt it. Eyes on us, watching from the trees. Emily clung to my arm, her breaths coming in quick, panicked gasps. I kept the flashlight trained on the path in front of us, forcing myself to keep moving, one step at a time. As we made our way down the trail, the fog seemed to press in closer, muffling every sound except for our own footsteps crunching on the leaves. I kept looking back, convinced that I'd see that shadow again, slipping through the trees. But there was nothing, just darkness and fog, swallowing the world whole. We reached the car, practically throwing ourselves inside, and I turned the engine over, the headlights cutting through the mist as I floored it down the rutted forest road. Emily sat beside me, her face pale, her hands trembling in her lap. I didn't stop until we were miles away, back on the main road, the safety of the town lights in the distance. Only then did I let out a shaky breath, glancing at my sister. Her eyes were red, her cheeks streaked with silent tears, and I realized then how close we'd come to something we couldn't explain. We never talked about that night again, and I never went back to that part of the woods. But sometimes, on cold, foggy nights when the wind howls through the trees, I think I hear it, that same scraping sound, like claws on wood, and I remember the shadow that watched us from the dark. Story 4. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the silence. No birds chirping, no rustling of leaves, just an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something was wrong, and I knew it even before I unzipped the tent. My name's Mike Thornton, and I've been camping in these mountains with my buddy John since we were kids. We thought we knew every inch of these woods, every sound, every smell, but nothing could have prepared us for what we encountered that weekend. It started innocently enough. John and I had decided to explore a new area, a secluded valley we'd heard about from some local hikers. The trek was challenging, but the pristine beauty of the untouched wilderness made it worth every step. We set up camp near a bubbling stream, the sound of water over rocks a soothing lullaby as we drifted off to sleep. But now, as I crawled out of the tent into the grey light of dawn, that peaceful atmosphere was gone. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. John was already up, his face pale as he stood by the remains of our campfire. "Mike," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "our food's gone, all of it." I blinked, sure I had misheard him. "What do you mean, gone?" But as I looked around our campsite, I saw he was right. The heavy-duty cooler we'd secured with bungee cords was nowhere to be seen. Our backpacks, which we'd hung from a high branch to keep away from bears, were on the ground, torn open, their contents strewn across the forest floor. "Maybe it was a bear," I suggested, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew it wasn't true. Bears were messy, but this was different. There was a deliberateness to the destruction that sent a chill down my spine. John shook his head. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a nearby pine tree. As I approached, I felt my stomach drop. Deep gouges marred the trunk, 4 parallel lines that started about 7 feet up and ran almost to the ground. They were fresh, the sap still oozing from the wounds in the bark. "Those aren't bear claws," I muttered, running my fingers over the marks. They were too big, too widely spaced, and they were high, much higher than any bear could reach. John and I exchanged a look. We'd grown up with stories of Bigfoot, of strange creatures lurking in the wilderness, but we'd always laughed them off as campfire tales, nothing more. Now, faced with evidence we couldn't explain, those stories didn't seem so funny anymore. "We should pack up," John said, his voice steady despite the fear I could see in his eyes. "Get back to the trailhead before—" A sound cut him off, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We froze, our eyes scanning the tree line. The forest had gone deathly quiet again, as if every living thing was holding its breath. That's when we saw it. About 50 yards away, half hidden by the undergrowth, was an opening in the rocky hillside. A cave, its mouth yawning black against the grey stone. "Was that there yesterday?" John whispered. I shook my head. We'd set up camp in this clearing specifically because it was open, with good sightlines in all directions. There's no way we could have missed a cave that size, but there it was, and as we watched, something moved in the shadows at its entrance. Something big. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to grab what was left of our gear and get the hell out of there. But curiosity, that dangerous human trait, kept me rooted to the spot. I had to know what we were dealing with. "We should check it out," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. John looked at me like I'd gone mad. "Are you crazy? We need to leave now." But I was already moving towards the cave, drawn by a force I couldn't explain. John, ever the loyal friend, cursed under his breath but followed. As we got closer, the smell hit us. It was a musky, animal odor, but with an underlying scent I couldn't place. Something ancient and wild. The ground around the cave entrance was littered with bones, mostly small animals, but I spotted what looked disturbingly like a human femur half buried in the leaves. We paused at the mouth of the cave, peering into the darkness. The growl came again, louder this time, echoing from deep within the earth. Something was in there, watching us. "Mike," John said, his voice tight with fear, "we need to go. Now." I nodded, finally coming to my senses. Whatever was in that cave, it wasn't something 2 unprepared campers should be messing with. We turned to leave, and that's when we heard it. A sound that will haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. It was a howl, but not like any animal I'd ever heard. It started low, almost subsonic, before rising to a pitch that made my teeth ache. It was filled with hunger, with rage, with something that felt almost human. We ran. I've never moved so fast in my life. We tore through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces, roots trying to trip us at every step. Behind us, I could hear something crashing through the forest, gaining on us with every stride. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. What I saw defied explanation. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur, but it wasn't the size that terrified me. It was the eyes, intelligent, aware, filled with a hunger that was all too human. We reached our campsite in a matter of minutes, though it felt like hours. "The car!" John gasped, already grabbing what he could of our scattered gear. "We need to get to the car." But I knew we'd never make it. The trailhead was miles away, and whatever was chasing us was fast. Too fast. We needed another plan. "The stream," I said, an idea forming. "We can lose it in the water." John nodded, understanding immediately. We'd used the same trick to shake off a particularly persistent black bear years ago. Without another word, we plunged into the icy water of the stream. The shock of the cold nearly took my breath away, but fear kept me moving. We waded downstream, trying to keep our footing on the slippery rocks. Behind us, I could hear our pursuer crashing through the trees, its howls of frustration echoing off the canyon walls. We stayed in the water for what felt like hours, only leaving the stream when the roar of a waterfall reached our ears. Climbing out on the opposite bank, we collapsed on the rocky shore, gasping for breath. What was that thing?" John panted, his eyes wild. I shook my head, unable to find words. How could I describe something that shouldn't exist? Something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. We sat there for a long time, listening to the forest slowly come back to life around us. Whatever had chased us seemed to be gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of our situation set in. We were miles from our car, with no food, minimal gear, and night falling fast. And somewhere out there, something was hunting us. "We need to move," I said, forcing myself to my feet. "Stick to the water as much as we can. With any luck, we can make it back to the trailhead by morning." John nodded, his face set in grim determination. As we started our long trek back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that our lives had changed irrevocably. The world was bigger, stranger, and far more dangerous than we had ever imagined. We walked through the night, jumping at every shadow, every snapping twig. By the time we reached our car, the sun was peeking over the horizon. We drove home in silence, both lost in our thoughts. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened. We researched cryptids, spoke to local experts, even considered going to the media. But in the end, we kept our experience to ourselves. Who would believe us? We barely believed it ourselves. But one thing was certain. We would never look at the wilderness the same way again. Those dark forests held secrets, ancient and terrifying. And sometimes, just sometimes, those secrets came out to hunt. As I sit here now, writing this down, I can't help but glance out my window at the distant mountains. They call to me, a siren song of mystery and danger. I know I'll go back someday. I have to, because now I know the truth that lurks in the whispers of the pines, and once you know, you can never unknow. The wilderness is vast, and we are not alone. Story 5. It's strange how small things can turn a peaceful hike into a nightmare. I'm the kind of person who finds comfort in the woods, quiet, away from the hum of the city, just me and the trees and the endless sky. That's why I was out there, on the Ridgeback Trail, miles away from the nearest road, but I'll never forget the moment I found those 3 stones, stacked neatly on the side of the path, a little too perfect to be natural. Looking back, I wish I'd never touched them. The day had started off like any other, cool and crisp with that autumn scent in the air, leaves just starting to turn, the sunlight dappled through the canopy above. I'd been hiking since early morning, my backpack light, just enough supplies for a few hours' walk. The trail was quiet, barely a whisper of wind, the only sounds the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional bird call. I'd wandered deeper than usual, finding a narrow offshoot of the trail that wound up a ridge and into a thick grove of pines. It felt like no one had been through there in years, and that's when I saw them, the stones. 3 small rocks, stacked one atop the other, right beside the trail. Each one was smooth, round, like they'd been plucked from a riverbed. They were arranged too carefully to have just fallen that way, balanced with an eerie precision. For a moment, I just stared at them, a strange unease settling in my chest. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably just some other hiker, maybe a kid playing a joke, but the feeling lingered, a nagging sense that I was intruding on something I didn't understand. I almost left them alone, but then curiosity got the better of me. I bent down, brushed the dirt off one of the stones, and let it tumble into my hand. The moment I disturbed that pile, the air around me seemed to shift, like a sudden drop in pressure, making my ears pop. The forest, which had been filled with the rustling of leaves and distant birdsong, went deathly quiet. I glanced around, but nothing had changed, just the same trees, the same shadows, stretching between the trunks. Shaking my head, I placed the rock back where I'd found it, a little embarrassed at my own jumpiness. But as I straightened up, I noticed something else. A few yards up the trail, almost hidden by the undergrowth, was another stack, 3 more stones, perfectly balanced. This time, a chill crept up my spine. They were exactly like the first, positioned at the edge of the path as if to guide me forward. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the unease that tightened my chest, and continued walking. I found another stack maybe 20 minutes later, then another. Each time, they were placed just off the trail, like little markers leading me deeper into the woods. And each time, the silence around me grew thicker, like the trees were holding their breath. After the 4th or 5th stack, I felt it again. That shift in the air, the prickling sensation that I wasn't alone. It was stupid, I know. I should have turned back right then, but something about those stones felt like a challenge, like whoever or whatever had put them there wanted me to keep going. I've never been good at backing down from a dare, even when I should be, so I kept following the trail, winding higher into the ridge, my breath clouding in the cool air. Eventually, the trail petered out into a clearing, a small open space surrounded by dense pines, the ground covered in a thick carpet of pine needles. In the center of the clearing, there was another stack of stones. Only this time, they were bigger, 3 larger rocks, each one the size of my head, balanced in a rough pyramid shape. I stared at them, my mouth dry, my heart beating a little too fast. I took a few steps closer, and that's when I noticed the smell, a faint, metallic tang like rusted iron. It was out of place, wrong for a forest. I circled the stones, my boots crunching softly on the needles, but there was nothing else in the clearing, just that same unnatural silence, as if the whole forest was waiting for something. I reached out, hesitating for just a moment before my fingers brushed the top stone. The moment I touched it, a deep, resonant sound echoed through the trees, a low rumble that I felt more than heard, like the growl of some enormous creature. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and I snatched my hand back, heart pounding. Suddenly, I heard something else, a faint, rhythmic sound coming from the trees behind me. At first, I thought it was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, but as it grew louder, I realized it wasn't that. It was footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving through the undergrowth. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the trees, but the beam barely cut through the shadows. The fog had started to roll in, creeping through the pines like smoke. I could just make out a shape moving between the trunks, something big, taller than a man, hunched over as it moved. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the stones. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Is someone there?" No reply. The footsteps paused, just on the edge of my vision, and for a moment I thought I saw eyes. Two pale, glinting orbs reflecting the light. They were too high up to belong to any person, but before I could make sense of it, the shape melted back into the fog. I backed away from the clearing, keeping my eyes on the trees, my pulse roaring in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to move slowly, afraid that if I turned my back, I'd hear those footsteps again, closing in behind me. My flashlight beam wavered, shaking in my trembling hand. Then, as I reached the edge of the clearing, I heard it again, a low, guttural growl, reverberating through the trees. It sent a jolt of fear through my chest, and without thinking, I turned and bolted down the trail. Branches whipped against my face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't care about the stones or the strange path. I just needed to get out of there, back to the safety of the trailhead, back to my truck. But no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps followed, crashing through the underbrush behind me, always just out of sight. The fog grew thicker, swirling around me, making the world feel small and suffocating. My lungs burned, but I couldn't slow down, couldn't stop. I could feel it getting closer, the ground trembling with each heavy step, as if the earth itself was shaking. Finally, I burst through the trees and saw my truck parked at the edge of the trailhead, a pale beacon in the fog. I practically threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me, fumbling with the keys. As the engine roared to life, I glanced back toward the trail, half expecting to see whatever had been chasing me, but there was nothing, just shadows and mist, the trees swaying gently in the wind. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I hit the gas, tires skidding on the gravel as I sped down the forest road, my hands shaking on the wheel. My heart was still pounding, the growl and the footsteps echoing in my head. I didn't stop driving until I reached town, until the fog and the woods were miles behind me. When I finally got home, I locked the door, double-checked every window, and sat in the dark with my hands clenched in my lap. I tried to convince myself that it had all been in my head, that maybe it was just an animal or some other hiker playing tricks, but I knew better. I couldn't shake the memory of those stones, stacked with such care, leading me deeper into the woods. I couldn't forget the way the air had shifted, the silence that had swallowed the forest whole, and I knew, deep down, that whatever I'd disturbed out there wasn't finished with me. Now, every time I hear the sound of rocks clinking together, kids playing, gravel shifting under tires, my stomach knots with fear. I haven't been back to the Ridgeback Trail since that day, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, on foggy nights when the world goes quiet, I catch myself glancing toward the woods, half expecting to see a shadow, tall and hulking, slipping between the trees, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't put that first stone back. Story 6. The crunch of leaves under my boots was the only sound in the forest, until it wasn't. That's when I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and suddenly the peaceful solitude I'd been enjoying turned into something far more sinister. My name is Emily Sinclair, and I've always found solace in solo hiking. There's something about the quiet of the forest, the challenge of the trail, that centers me like nothing else. But on that crisp autumn day, as the shadows lengthened and the air grew chill, I discovered that sometimes the forest holds secrets darker than I could have imagined. It started as a typical hike. I'd chosen a lesser-known trail in the Cascade Mountains, eager to escape the weekend crowds and immerse myself in nature. The trail was challenging, winding its way through old-growth forest and along steep ridgelines. By mid-afternoon, I'd left the few other hikers I'd seen far behind, relishing the solitude. The first hint that something was off came as I was taking a water break. A twig snapped somewhere behind me, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. I turned, expecting to see another hiker, or maybe a deer, but there was nothing there, just the endless sea of trees stretching out in every direction. I shrugged it off, blaming it on my imagination, but as I continued hiking, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more and more frequently. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that didn't sound human. They were too slow, too measured, and far too heavy. Whatever was making those sounds was big, much bigger than any animal I knew inhabited these woods. My heart rate spiked, and I picked up my pace. The rational part of my brain tried to calm me down. It's probably just a bear, I told myself, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. Bears don't stalk like this. They don't follow with such purposeful intent. I rounded a bend in the trail and caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. Something large and dark slipped behind a tree, something that walked on two legs. Panic surged through me, and I broke into a run. The trail became a blur as I sprinted, my backpack bouncing painfully against my spine. Behind me, I could hear the footsteps quicken, matching my pace with ease. I chanced to look over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. There, no more than 50 yards behind me, was a figure that defied explanation. It was tall, impossibly tall, covered in dark fur. But it wasn't the size that terrified me most. It was the way it moved. Fluid, purposeful, unmistakably intelligent. A scream built in my throat, but I choked it back. Some primal instinct told me that making noise would only make things worse. Instead, I focused all my energy on running, on putting as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. The trail narrowed, hugging the side of a steep ravine. Under normal circumstances, I would have slowed down, picked my way carefully along the treacherous path, but these were far from normal circumstances. I ran full tilt, my feet barely touching the ground as I flew along the narrow track. Behind me, I could hear my pursuer gaining ground. Its footfalls shook the earth, sending small avalanches of pebbles cascading down the ravine. The sound spurred me on, pushing my burning muscles beyond their limits. As I rounded another bend, my foot caught on an exposed root. I stumbled, my momentum carrying me forward and off the trail. For a heart-stopping moment, I was airborne, the ravine yawning beneath me. Then I hit the slope, tumbling head over heels down the steep incline. I came to a stop at the bottom of the ravine, battered and bruised, but miraculously unbroken. Dazed, I looked up at the trail above me. There, silhouetted against the darkening sky, stood the creature. It was like something out of a nightmare, 8 feet tall at least, with broad shoulders and long, powerful arms. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its gaze locked onto me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, with deliberate slowness, it began to make its way down the slope towards me. Panic gave me strength. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the protests of my battered body, and plunged into the undergrowth at the bottom of the ravine. Branches whipped at my face as I ran. Thorns tore at my clothes, but I didn't slow down. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the forest with terrifying speed. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that green twilight beneath the trees. My world narrowed to the pounding of my heart, the burning in my lungs, and the constant, terrifying sound of pursuit. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, when my legs were about to give out, I burst out of the forest and onto a logging road. The sudden openness was shocking after the claustrophobic density of the woods. For a moment, I stood there, gasping for breath, unsure which way to go. The decision was made for me when I heard a vehicle approaching. An old pickup truck came around the bend, its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. I waved my arms frantically, relief flooding through me as the truck slowed to a stop. An older man leaned out the window, concern etched on his weathered face. "You all right, miss?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to explain, to warn him about the creature in the woods, but no words came out. How could I describe what I'd seen? Who would believe me? I got lost. I managed to stammer out, "Can you give me a ride to the nearest town?" He nodded, gesturing for me to get in. As I climbed into the truck, I couldn't help but look back at the forest. There, just inside the tree line, I saw it. A pair of eyes reflecting the truck's headlights, set high above the ground. As we drove away, I watched those eyes recede into the darkness, a silent promise that this wasn't over. The drive back to civilization was a blur. The old man, sensing my distress, didn't push for conversation. He dropped me off at a small diner in the nearest town, concern still evident in his eyes as he made sure I was okay before driving off. I sat in that diner for hours, nursing a cup of coffee that grew cold, trying to make sense of what had happened. My mind kept replaying the chase, the glimpses I'd caught of my pursuer. What was it? Some unknown species? A creature out of legend? Or had fear and exhaustion caused me to imagine the whole thing, but I knew, deep down, that it had been real. The bruises on my body, the tears in my clothes, and the lingering terror in my gut were proof enough. Something was out there in those woods, something that defied explanation. As I finally left the diner and checked into a nearby motel, I knew my life had changed irrevocably. The world was bigger, stranger, and far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The forests I had always seen as a sanctuary now held a darkness I couldn't ignore. In the days and weeks that followed, I researched obsessively. I read about Bigfoot sightings, about mysterious creatures spotted in forests around the world. I found others who had experiences similar to mine, their stories echoing the terror I had felt. But I didn't go public with my story. Who would believe me? Instead, I kept it to myself, a secret that both terrified and fascinated me. I knew I should stay away from the forests, stick to populated areas where I was safe, but the pull was too strong. 2 months after my encounter, I found myself back on a trail, different mountains, different forest, but the same sense of solitude that I had always loved. Only now, that solitude was tinged with something else: excitement, fear, anticipation. As I hiked deeper into the woods, my senses alert for any sign of danger, I realized a fundamental truth. The encounter hadn't driven me away from the wilderness. It had drawn me in deeper. Because now I knew that the forests held mysteries beyond imagination, and somewhere out there, between the shadows of the trees, something was waiting. I don't know if I'll ever see that creature again. Part of me hopes I do, while another part dreads the possibility, but one thing is certain. I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. Every snapping twig, every shadowy movement carries the potential for the extraordinary. And as I walk these quiet trails, I can't help but wonder, am I the hunter now, or am I still the prey? Story 7. The snow muffled everything, the crunch of my boots, the rustle of the wind through the bare branches, even my breath clouding the frigid air. Winter in the mountains has a way of turning the world into a hushed, eerie place, like stepping into a different time. I've guided plenty of groups through these woods, people looking for a taste of the wild, eager to leave the city behind for a few days. But that day, with the sun dipping low and shadows stretching long across the snow, something felt different, off in a way I couldn't quite put into words. And then I saw them, the tracks, larger than any I'd ever seen before, pressed deep into the fresh snow. It started out as an ordinary trip. I had a small group of 3 hikers, Matt, Sarah, and Jim. They were all experienced enough, looking for a winter challenge, so I took them up to the high ridges, where the air was thin and the snow lay thick on the ground. The weather was holding steady, clear skies, cold but not bitter, and the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. We made good progress through the morning, winding our way along the ridge, the snow crunching underfoot. Matt and Jim were up ahead, chatting about gear, while Sarah lagged behind, taking photos of the frost-covered trees. I kept to myself, focusing on the trail, making sure we stayed on course. We reached a narrow valley around midday, a shallow dip between two ridges, with a frozen creek running along the bottom. I decided it'd be a good place to break for lunch, and we gathered under a cluster of pines, the branches weighed down with snow. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the valley, and the air had that sharp bite that only comes in deep winter. As we were eating, Sarah suddenly went quiet, staring down the length of the valley. I followed her gaze, and that's when I noticed the tracks, massive impressions in the snow, spaced evenly, heading toward the ridge. They cut through the untouched snow, each print at least twice the size of my boot, as if something heavy had walked through there recently. "Hey, John," Sarah said, her voice tight with unease. "What do you think made those?" I stood up, brushed the snow from my gloves, and walked over to get a closer look. My gut tightened as I crouched beside the nearest print. It was too big to be a bear, and the shape was wrong, more elongated, with what looked like toe marks at the front, and the stride. Whatever had made these tracks had a long, deliberate gait, like it had been walking on two legs. "Probably an animal," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe a moose or a bear walking upright." Jim snorted. "A moose, huh? You ever seen a moose that big around here?" I didn't answer. I didn't want to admit that I hadn't. Instead, I reached out and touched the edge of the print, feeling how deep it went into the snow, much deeper than it should have, even for a heavy animal. My skin prickled with unease, but I forced a smile and stood up, brushing off my gloves. "Come on, let's get moving," I said, forcing cheer into my voice. "We need to make it to the shelter before dark." But as we packed up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, hidden among the shadows beneath the trees. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no distant rustle of animals, just the whisper of the wind through the branches. It was as if everything had gone still, waiting. We set off again, following the trail up toward the ridge. The tracks paralleled our path, winding through the trees, always just close enough to remind us they were there. I caught Sarah glancing over at them more than once, her brow furrowed with worry, but none of us spoke about it. We just kept moving, our breaths fogging in the cold air, our footsteps crunching in unison. By the time we reached the shelter, the light was fading, the sky turning from gold to deep blue. The old wooden structure stood nestled against a rocky outcrop, half buried in snow, but it was solid enough, a roof over our heads and walls to keep out the wind. We set about making camp, getting a fire going in the stove, and soon the warmth chased away some of the unease that had settled over us. But when I stepped outside to grab more firewood, I froze. The tracks were back, fresh prints, circling the shelter, closer now, like something had been pacing around while we set up camp. They were deeper than before, the snow packed down hard under the weight. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and not from the cold. My flashlight beams swept over the trees, but all I saw were shadows, dark shapes blending into the night. The wind moaned through the branches, but there was no other sound, no snap of a twig, no crunch of snow underfoot. Just that silence, pressing in all around me. I forced myself to take a breath, grabbing an armful of wood and heading back inside. When I shut the door, I locked it, sliding the heavy bolt into place. Sarah glanced up from where she was huddled by the stove, rubbing her hands together for warmth. "You okay, John?" she asked, her voice low. "Yeah," I lied, dumping the wood beside the fire. "Just cold out there." but the look in her eyes told me she knew I wasn't telling the whole truth. I couldn't blame her. She'd seen the tracks too, and the way my hands shook as I lit the fire earlier. Matt and Jim were still outside, unpacking gear, and I felt a stab of worry, but I didn't know how to explain the dread that had settled in my chest. By the time the others came in, the wind had picked up, rattling the loose boards of the shelter. We ate in silence, the air thick with unspoken tension. No one mentioned the tracks, but I caught Matt glancing toward the door more than once, as if he expected something to burst through at any moment. It wasn't until later, when we were settling into our sleeping bags, that I heard it, a low, rumbling sound, almost like a growl, drifting in on the wind. My breath caught in my throat, and I sat up, straining to listen. The others heard it too. I could see it in the way their bodies tensed, their eyes wide in the dim firelight. "Did you hear that?" Jim whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yeah," I replied, my mouth dry. "Probably just the wind." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The sound had a weight to it, a deep, resonant quality that no gust of wind could produce. It came again, closer this time, and the hair on my arms stood on end. Matt, always the skeptic, got up and grabbed the flashlight. "I'm going to check it out," he muttered, sounding more like he was trying to convince himself than us. Before I could stop him, he swung open the door and stepped out into the night. The beam of his flashlight cut through the snow, sweeping across the tracks that encircled the shelter. For a moment, everything was still, the silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. And then, from the darkness beyond the circle of light, something moved. I caught a glimpse of it, a shadow slipping between the trees, massive and hunched, too tall, too broad to be anything I'd ever seen before. Matt froze, the flashlight trembling in his hand, and then he was backing up, stumbling over his own feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Get inside!" I hissed, grabbing the door. Matt darted back into the shelter, slamming the door behind him, his face pale. He didn't say a word, just locked the bolt with shaking hands. We all sat there, staring at the door, the fire crackling softly behind us. The growl came again, closer this time, vibrating through the walls, and then something heavy brushed against the outside of the shelter, scraping along the wood. Sarah let out a choked sob, and Jim clamped a hand over her mouth, his eyes wide with terror. For what felt like hours, we huddled there, listening to the slow, heavy footsteps that circled the shelter, the deep breaths that steamed the air outside. I could see the fear on their faces, the same fear that gripped my own chest, squeezing tight. Eventually, the sounds faded, swallowed by the wind, but none of us slept that night. We just sat by the stove, watching the flames dance, jumping at every creak and groan. When dawn finally broke, we packed up in silence, too scared to linger. The tracks were still there, clearer in the pale morning light, circling our shelter, then leading off into the trees, disappearing up the ridge. I caught one last glimpse of them before we left, each print perfectly defined in the snow, like something had been watching us, waiting. We made it back to the trailhead by noon, none of us speaking a word about what we'd heard or seen. Matt and Jim left without so much as a goodbye, their faces pale, drawn. Sarah hugged me tight before she climbed into her car, her eyes haunted. I've tried to forget that night, tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, just the tricks of a mind half-crazed with cold and fear. But deep down, I know that something was out there, something that moved silently through the snow, something that left those deep, deliberate tracks. And every winter, when the snow starts to fall, I think of those prints, and I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for someone else to follow them into the woods. Story 8. The moment I saw the creature on the opposite shore, I knew our fishing trip had taken a turn into the realm of the impossible. What started as a peaceful day on the water quickly became a fight for survival against something that shouldn't exist. My name is Jake Thompson, and my younger brother Tom and I have been coming to this remote lake in northern Minnesota for years. It's always been our escape, a place where we could forget about the world and just enjoy the simple pleasure of fishing. But on that day, the lake revealed a secret that would change our lives forever. The morning had started like any other fishing trip. We loaded up our small boat with gear, packed enough food and water for the day, and set out just as the sun was peeking over the horizon. The lake was calm, its surface a mirror reflecting the pink and gold of the dawn sky. The air was crisp with the lingering chill of the night, carrying the scent of pine and clean water. Tom and I didn't talk much as we motored out to our favorite spot. We didn't need to. Years of shared experiences had given us a comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional comment about the weather or a joke about who would catch the biggest fish this time. We anchored in a small cove, sheltered by towering pines that seemed to touch the sky. The fishing was good that morning. We caught several decent-sized bass and even a couple of walleye. As the sun climbed higher, we relaxed, enjoying the peaceful solitude of the lake. It was just after noon when we heard it, a howl that echoed across the water, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It started low, almost like a wolf's call, but rose to a pitch that sent shivers down my spine. Tom and I exchanged glances, our hands frozen on our fishing rods. "What the hell was that?" Tom whispered, his eyes scanning the shoreline. I shook my head, unable to answer. In all our years coming to this lake, we'd never heard anything like it. The sound came again, closer this time, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. But as I reached for the anchor, Tom grabbed my arm. "Jake," he said, his voice tight with fear. "Look." I followed his gaze to the opposite shore, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a bear, standing upright at the water's edge. But as I squinted against the midday sun, I realized this was something else entirely. It was tall, at least 7 or 8 feet, covered in dark, matted fur, but it wasn't the size that made my blood run cold. It was the way it stood, perfectly balanced on 2 legs, its posture unmistakably humanoid, and its eyes, visible even at this distance, glowed with an intelligence that was anything but animal. Is that a Bigfoot?" Tom whispered, his voice cracking. I couldn't answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you wanted to call it. These were stories, legends. They weren't supposed to be real. The creature stood watching us for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, with a speed that defied its size, it turned and disappeared into the dense forest. "We need to go," I said, finally finding my voice. "Now?" Tom nodded, his face pale. I reached for the starter cord on the outboard motor, giving it a hard pull. Nothing happened. I tried again and again, but the engine refused to start. "What's wrong?" Tom asked, panic edging into his voice. "I don't know," I replied, trying to keep calm. "It was fine this morning." I opened the engine housing, hoping to find an obvious problem, but everything looked normal. As I fiddled with the motor, I heard Tom gasp. "Jake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "it's back." I looked up, and my heart nearly stopped. The creature was at the water's edge again, but this time it wasn't alone. 2 more stood beside it, their massive forms silhouetted against the trees. As we watched, frozen in disbelief, they began to wade into the lake. "They're coming towards us," Tom said, his voice shaking. I abandoned the motor and grabbed the oars. "Start rowing," I told Tom, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "We need to get to the other side of the lake." We began to row, our strokes frantic and uncoordinated at first, but soon falling into a rhythm born of desperation. I could hear splashing behind us, growing louder with each passing moment. "Don't look back," I told Tom, seeing him start to turn his head. "Just keep rowing." The shore seemed impossibly far away. My arms burned with the effort, sweat running into my eyes despite the cool air. I could hear Tom's ragged breathing, matching my own. A roar split the air, so close it seemed to vibrate through the boat. Against my own advice, I looked back. The creatures were less than 50 yards behind us, moving through the water with powerful strokes. Their eyes, fixed on our small boat, glowed with an otherworldly light. "Faster!" I gasped, redoubling my efforts. Tom did the same, his face a mask of terror and determination. We were almost to the shore when I felt the boat lurch. One of the creatures had grabbed the stern, its massive hand easily spanning the width of the small craft. The boat tipped dangerously, water sloshing over the sides. "Jump!" I yelled to Tom. "Swim for the shore!" We plunged into the cold water just as the boat capsized. I surfaced, gasping for air, and saw Tom a few yards away, already swimming towards the shore. I followed, every stroke fueled by pure adrenaline. I could hear splashing behind me, heavy breathing that wasn't human. I didn't dare look back, focusing everything I had on reaching the shore. My feet touched bottom, and I half swam, half ran through the shallows, collapsing onto the pebbly beach beside Tom. For a moment, we just lay there, gulping air into our burning lungs. Then, slowly, we turned to look at the lake. The creatures stood in the shallows, watching us. They made no move to come closer, but they didn't retreat either. It was as if they were waiting for something. "What do we do?" Tom asked, his voice hoarse. I shook my head, at a loss. We were miles from the nearest road. Our boat was gone, and we were facing creatures that shouldn't exist. The rational part of my brain was shut down, overwhelmed by the impossibility of our situation. As we watched, the largest of the creatures raised its head and let out another of those bone-chilling howls. The sound echoed across the lake, seeming to shake the very air around us. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the creatures turned and began to swim back to the far shore. We sat on that beach for hours, unable to move, unable to process what we had seen. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, we finally stirred. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. Tom nodded, his eyes still fixed on the far shore. "Will anyone believe us?" I didn't answer. I didn't know. Part of me wasn't sure I believed it myself, despite having seen it with my own eyes. We started the long walk back to civilization, following the lakeshore until we found a trail. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush made us jump. The forest, once so familiar and comforting, now felt alien and threatening. It was well past midnight when we finally reached the small town where we had left our car. We drove home in silence, both lost in our thoughts. In the days that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened. We researched cryptids, spoke to local experts, even considered going to the media. But in the end, we kept our experience to ourselves. The fear of ridicule, of being labeled as crazy, was too great. But we never forgot. How could we? Our worldview had been shattered, replaced by the knowledge that the world was far stranger and more mysterious than we had ever imagined. We never went back to that lake, but sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself drawn to the window, looking out at the darkness beyond. And I wonder about what else might be out there, hidden in the shadows of the wilderness, waiting to be discovered, or perhaps waiting to discover us. The lake may have revealed its secret, but I can't help feeling that it was just the beginning. There are more mysteries out there, more impossibilities waiting to become real, and someday I know we'll find them, or they'll find us. Story 9. There's something about the darkness just before dawn that makes you feel like you're the last person on Earth. That's why I've always loved the early morning patrols at the national park. The world is quiet, asleep, and the trees seem to hold their breath. But that morning, as I walked the Ridgeway Trail, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. For weeks, I'd been seeing something on the hill, a pair of eyes reflecting back at me in the darkness, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It had become my shadow, lurking at the edge of the forest, always watching. The first time I noticed it, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. It was a fleeting glimpse from my patrol truck as I made my way down the gravel road, headlights sweeping across the hill, two small, round glimmers, low to the ground. But then I saw them again, the next night, and the night after that, always in the same spot, just before dawn. I'd shine my flashlight up the hill, trying to catch a clearer view, but whatever it was, always melted back into the shadows before I could focus on it. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, a reflection in the fog that clung to the valley. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was there, something that watched me with an unsettling, patient focus. On that particular morning, I was already on edge. A couple of hikers had reported strange noises the night before, low, rumbling sounds, like the growl of a big cat, coming from somewhere up near the ridge. I'd brushed it off at the time, figuring it was a bear or maybe a mountain lion moving through. But as I walked the Ridgeway Trail that morning, my flashlight beam cutting through the pre-dawn mist, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air was crisp, biting through my jacket, my breath clouding in the thin light. The woods were silent, no birdsong yet, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground. As I rounded a bend, the hill came into view, its slope rising out of the trees like a dark wave. That's when I saw them again. The eyes. This time they were higher, more elevated, like whatever was watching me had grown taller or was standing on two legs. They glinted back at me from the ridge, motionless and unblinking, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. A shiver ran through me, and I tightened my grip on the flashlight, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. I called out, my voice rough in the still air, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Hey, who's out there?" The words echoed back to me, swallowed up by the trees. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink, just held steady, staring down at me from the shadows. I swept the flashlight beam across the hill, but the fog thickened around it, turning everything into a blur of grey and black. For a moment, I stood there, caught between fear and curiosity. Then, with a deep breath, I made up my mind. I was tired of feeling watched, tired of the knot of anxiety that tightened every time I patrolled this part of the woods. I wasn't going to let some trick of the light scare me off my own turf. I left the trail, heading up the slope toward the ridge, my boots slipping on the frost-covered leaves. The undergrowth clawed at my pants, and the air grew colder, sharper, the higher I climbed. My breath came in short, quick bursts, and I kept the flashlight trained on those eyes, refusing to let them disappear from my sight. But as I got closer, the eyes vanished. 1 second, they were there, glinting in the darkness, and the next, they blinked out, swallowed by the shadows. I stopped, my chest heaving, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my own heart. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, pressing down on me. I was about to turn back, chalk it all up to a wild goose chase, when I heard it, something moving through the trees, slow and deliberate, the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the snow and leaves. I froze, gripping my flashlight tighter, swinging the beam around wildly. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, replaced by a low, rumbling breath. It was close, too close, like whatever was out there had crept up on me without me realizing it. I felt my stomach drop, fear spiking through me like a blade of ice. "Who's there?" I called again, but this time my voice trembled, cracking on the last word. The only answer was a low growl, so deep that I felt it reverberate through my chest. It came from somewhere just ahead, where the darkness was thickest, and I realized with a jolt of terror that I couldn't see the ground in front of me anymore. The mist had thickened, swirling up from the valley to wrap around me like a shroud. I took a step back, my boots slipping on the frozen ground, and the growl followed me, a deep, rumbling sound that raised every hair on my body. I swept my flashlight one last time across the hill, and for a brief, terrible moment, the beam caught a shape, tall, hunched, its breath steaming in the cold air. Then the light flickered, sputtered, and the shape melted back into the mist. Panic surged through me, and I turned and bolted down the hill, sliding and stumbling over roots and rocks, barely keeping my footing. The sound of footsteps followed, heavy and deliberate, but I didn't dare look back. I hit the trail with a jarring thud, my breath ragged, my legs burning from the sprint. I fumbled for my radio, desperate to call in for help, but all I got was static, a low hiss that drowned out everything else. I could hear the blood roaring in my ears, and beyond that, the growl, closer now, too close. The headlights of my truck were just visible through the trees, a distant glow that seemed a world away. I forced myself to run, forcing my legs to move, refusing to let the fear drag me down. The footsteps were right behind me, crunching through the snow, and I swore I could feel warm breath on the back of my neck. I burst into the clearing where my truck was parked, throwing myself against the door, wrenching it open. I scrambled inside, slamming the door shut, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the keys. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, the truck lurching forward over the uneven ground. As I sped down the gravel road, I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. For a second, I thought I saw it, something tall, something massive, standing in the middle of the road, its silhouette framed against the foggy darkness. Its eyes glinted, reflecting the red glow of my taillights. But then the road curved, and the shape disappeared behind the trees. I didn't stop driving until I reached the ranger station, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I stumbled inside, fumbling with the light switches, feeling like the darkness was pressing in on me even here. When the lights finally flickered on, I collapsed into a chair, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. The radio crackled beside me, finally cutting through the static, and a voice came through, my supervisor, gruff and tired. "Harris, you there? What's your status?" I stared at the radio, my mouth dry. How could I explain what had just happened? How could I describe that thing, those eyes that watched me, the growl that I could still hear echoing in my head? I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down, and picked up the receiver. I'm here. Everything's fine," I lied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just some strange noises. Probably an animal." There was a pause on the other end, then a sigh. "All right. Just be careful out there." I set the radio down, but the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching me from the shadows, waiting for the next time I ventured too far off the trail. Now, weeks later, I still see those eyes in my dreams, glinting through the mist, patient, unblinking. I've stopped taking the early morning patrols, but sometimes, late at night when I'm closing up the station, I catch a glimpse of something at the edge of the woods, a shadow on the hill, watching, waiting, and I know, deep down, that whatever I disturbed out there isn't done with me. Story 10. The shutter clicked, and in that instant, I knew I'd photographed something that would change my life forever. What I didn't realize was how close I was to becoming the prey instead of the observer. My name is Lisa Reeves, and I've been a wildlife photographer for over a decade. I've captured images of elusive predators in the African savanna, tracked polar bears across the Arctic ice, and spent countless nights in dense jungles waiting for the perfect shot. But nothing in my career could have prepared me for what I encountered in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, documenting the recovery of wolf populations in the region. I'd spent weeks tracking a particular pack, learning their habits, predicting their movements. On this crisp autumn morning, I'd positioned myself in a small clearing, my camera ready to capture the wolves as they moved through their territory. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional bird call and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. I'd been crouched in my hiding spot for hours, my muscles aching from the prolonged stillness, but years of experience had taught me patience, The perfect shot was worth any discomfort. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the canopy, I heard movement in the underbrush. My heart rate picked up, anticipation coursing through my veins. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. I raised my camera, finger poised over the shutter button. But what emerged from the trees wasn't a wolf, it was something else entirely. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The creature that lumbered into the clearing was massive, easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. It moved with an odd gait, somewhere between a bear's lumbering walk and a human stride. Its head swiveled, scanning the clearing, and for a heart-stopping moment I thought its gaze landed on me. Without thinking, I pressed the shutter button. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet forest, and I instantly regretted it. The creature's head snapped in my direction, and I got my first clear look at its face. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Not quite human, not quite animal. Its eyes, set deep under a heavy brow, glowed with an intelligence that sent a chill down my spine. Its mouth, filled with sharp teeth, was set in what looked almost like a grimace. For a moment, we stared at each other, frozen in mutual shock. Then, with a speed that defied its size, the creature turned and vanished into the forest. I sat there, my heart pounding, trying to process what I'd just seen. My hands shook as I looked at the display on my camera, scrolling to the image I'd just captured. There it was, blurry and a bit underexposed, but unmistakable. I'd just photographed something that shouldn't exist. As the initial shock wore off, excitement began to set in. This was the kind of discovery that could make a career. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you wanted to call it, I had proof, real, photographic evidence. I was so caught up in examining the photo that I almost missed the sound. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I looked up, suddenly aware of how exposed I was in the small clearing. The forest had gone silent, no birds, no rustling leaves, just that continuous, menacing growl. Slowly, I began to pack up my gear, my eyes darting from tree to tree, searching for any sign of movement. That's when I saw them, eyes, dozens of eyes, glowing in the shadows between the trees. They were all around me, watching, waiting. I realized with a sinking feeling that I wasn't dealing with just one creature. There was a whole group of them, and I was surrounded. Fear gripped me, making it hard to breathe. I'd been in dangerous situations before, charged by elephants, stalked by lions, but this was different. These creatures were intelligent, coordinated, and they had me cornered. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I burst out of the clearing, my camera bag bouncing against my hip as I sprinted through the forest. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me at every step, but I didn't slow down. Behind me, I could hear them giving chase, their heavy footfalls shaking the ground. I had no idea where I was going. All sense of direction was lost in the panic of the moment. I just knew I had to keep moving, had to find a way out of this nightmare. The sound of rushing water reached my ears, and I angled towards it. Maybe if I could cross a river, I could lose them. I burst out of the tree line and found myself on the bank of a fast-moving stream. Without hesitation, I plunged in. The cold water shocked me, nearly taking my breath away. The current was stronger than I'd anticipated, tugging at my legs as I fought my way across. Halfway across, I chanced to look back. They stood on the bank, their massive forms silhouetted against the trees. For a moment, I thought I'd escaped. Then, with powerful leaps, they began to enter the water. Panic gave me strength. I redoubled my efforts, fighting against the current with everything I had. My feet found the opposite bank, and I scrambled up, my clothes heavy with water. I didn't stop to rest. I could hear them behind me, their growls carrying over the sound of the rushing water. I pushed on, my lungs burning, my legs aching. The trees began to thin, and suddenly I was out of the forest, standing on the edge of a steep ravine. Far below, I could see a road winding through the valley. Civilization, safety. But it was too far, and the creatures were too close. I was trapped. To my left and right, the ravine stretched as far as I could see. Behind me, I could hear the creatures approaching. I was out of options. Or was I? My hand brushed against my camera bag, and an idea formed. A desperate, probably stupid idea, but it was all I had. I pulled out my camera, turning to face the forest just as the creatures emerged from the trees. There were 5 of them, spread out in a semicircle, cutting off any chance of escape. Their eyes gleamed with predatory intent as they slowly advanced. I raised my camera and started taking pictures. The flash went off, bright in the dim forest light. The creatures faltered, momentarily confused by the sudden bursts of light. I kept shooting, the rapid-fire clicks of the shutter punctuated by the flash. The creatures hesitated, some raising their hands to shield their eyes. It was working, but I knew it wouldn't last long. Just when I thought my luck had run out, I heard it. The distant sound of a helicopter. It grew louder, and suddenly it was there, cresting the ridge, its searchlight cutting through the trees. The creatures looked up, startled by the noise and light. For a moment, they seemed unsure, caught between their pursuit of me and their fear of this new threat. Then, as one, they turned and melted back into the forest, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. I collapsed to the ground, my body shaking with exhaustion and residual fear. The helicopter landed in a small, clear area nearby, and soon I was surrounded by park rangers, their concerned faces swimming in my vision as the adrenaline began to wear off. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. The rangers found no trace of the creatures, no footprints, no evidence to corroborate my story. But I had my photographs, blurry, imperfect, but undeniable proof of what I'd seen. I debated for a long time about what to do with those images. Part of me wanted to share them with the world, to prove that these creatures existed, but another part of me hesitated. I thought about those intelligent eyes, the coordinated way they had hunted me. These weren't just animals. They were something more. In the end, I kept the photos to myself. The world wasn't ready for this revelation, and maybe it never would be, but I knew the truth, and I knew that the next time I ventured into the wilderness, I wouldn't just be observing, I'd be watched as well. The forest holds many secrets, and on that day, I glimpsed just one of them. It changed me, changed how I see the world and my place in it. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself wondering, are they out there, watching? And what other mysteries are waiting to be discovered in the wild places of the world? Story 11. The woods change when the sun goes down. I've always known that. The air gets colder, the shadows grow longer, and the forest floor turns into a maze of dark shapes and rustling sounds. But there's a difference between the usual night sounds, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, and the feeling that something is out there, just beyond the reach of your flashlight, watching. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just me and Claire, my girlfriend, by the lake. But that night, as the fire crackled and the darkness pressed in around us, I realized we weren't alone. Something was moving between the trees. The day had started out perfectly. Clear skies, a light breeze. Claire and I had driven up to an isolated lake deep in the national forest, miles from any town or cell phone service. It was our spot, a place we'd come back to every summer to escape everything and everyone. We spent the afternoon setting up the tent, fishing from the shore, laughing at stupid jokes. It felt good to disconnect, to just be together, surrounded by the quiet of nature. By the time the sun began to set, we had a small fire going, and Claire was wrapped up in a blanket, sipping from a thermos of hot chocolate. I watched the sky turn from gold to deep purple, the stars starting to prick through the twilight. The lake was like a mirror, reflecting the last light of the day, and the woods stood tall and dark on the other side, turning into a wall of shadows as night settled in. We stayed up for a while, talking and enjoying the fire. But as the darkness grew thicker, I started to feel uneasy. It was subtle at first, just a sense that the night was too quiet. No frogs, no crickets. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I glanced over at Claire, but she didn't seem to notice anything, just smiled at me, her face warm in the firelight. But then, as I added a few more logs to the fire, I caught a glimpse of movement in the trees across the lake, a tall shadow slipping between the trunks, there one moment and gone the next. I froze, my hand hovering over the fire, straining to see into the darkness. "What's up?" Claire asked, her voice pulling me back. She followed my gaze across the water, squinting at the tree line. "Did you see something?" "Probably just a deer," I said, forcing a smile, but my gut twisted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been too tall, too deliberate in the way it moved. I kept my flashlight close, telling myself that it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. Claire yawned, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I think I'm going to head to bed. You coming?" "Yeah, in a bit," I replied, watching as she crawled into the tent, leaving me alone with the crackling fire and the creeping dark. I sat there for a while, poking at the embers, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things, but then I heard it, a soft crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. My head snapped up, and I swung the flashlight beam toward the sound, sweeping it across the trees on our side of the lake. The light wavered as my hand shook, revealing only empty branches and shadows. But just as I was about to lower the flashlight, I saw it again, a shape, half hidden behind a tree, a silhouette that was too tall and broad to be a person. It seemed to sway slightly, like it was adjusting its stance, watching me from the cover of the woods. My mouth went dry, and I felt a cold knot form in my chest. I blinked, and the shape was gone, swallowed by the shadows. The trees shifted in the wind, and the fire popped behind me, making me jump. I glanced back toward the tent, seeing Claire's silhouette through the fabric, fast asleep. I didn't want to wake her, didn't want to admit that I was spooked, but every instinct in me screamed that something wasn't right. I stood up, the flashlight beam bobbing wildly as I moved toward the edge of the lake. "Hello!" I called out, my voice sounding small against the vastness of the forest. "Is someone out there?" Silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring, that makes the darkness feel thick and heavy. I listened for a reply, for any rustle of movement, but there was nothing, just the wind whispering through the pines. I took a deep breath, shaking off the chill that had settled over me, and backed away from the water. "Probably just an animal," I muttered to myself, trying to laugh it off. But even as I crawled into the tent beside Claire, I kept the flashlight clutched in my hand, my ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. I must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a noise, something heavy moving outside the tent, the soft thud of footsteps on the forest floor. I froze, holding my breath, listening as the steps circled the camp, slow and deliberate. They were too heavy to be a deer, too steady to be random. It felt like someone was walking around our campsite, checking it out. I nudged Claire awake, pressing a finger to my lips before she could speak. Her eyes widened as she heard it too, the crunching footsteps, now just beyond the tent walls. We sat there, barely daring to breathe, listening as they came to a stop near the fire pit. Slowly, I unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek outside, my heart hammering in my chest. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to see the edge of the woods. And standing there at the line between shadow and firelight was a figure, tall, hunched, its shape all wrong. It was like a man, but not. Its limbs seemed too long, its shoulders too broad, tapering down to legs that bent in a strange, unnatural way. I couldn't see its face, just the silhouette, darker than the night around it, shifting slightly as it leaned forward, like it was sniffing the air. My hand tightened on the flashlight, and without thinking I turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness and hitting the figure square in the chest. For a split second, I saw a flash of something pale, glinting in the light, eyes reflecting back at me with an animal intensity. Then it moved so fast that I barely registered the blur of motion as it vanished into the trees. The flashlight's beam swung wildly, but all I caught were branches swaying, disturbed by something that had moved through them with impossible speed. Claire grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "Mike, what the hell was that?" "I don't know," I whispered, my voice barely holding steady. "But we're leaving. Now." We scrambled out of the tent, grabbing our packs with shaking hands. I kept the flashlight aimed at the woods, half expecting to see those eyes staring back at me again. But the trees were still, the night silent. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made any sense. All I knew was that we couldn't stay there. We hurried to the car, practically throwing our gear into the back seat. The keys slipped in my trembling fingers as I jammed them into the ignition, the engine finally roaring to life. I glanced back toward the campsite one last time, half expecting to see that shadowy figure at the edge of the firelight. But there was nothing, just the dark outline of the trees, the dying embers of the fire. It should have made me feel better, but instead, it made my skin crawl. Like whatever had been there was hiding, waiting for us to turn our backs. As I sped down the dirt road, the headlights carving a path through the night, Claire sat beside me, her hands wrapped around her knees, eyes wide and unblinking. Neither of us spoke, the fear hanging between us like a third presence in the car. We reached town just as dawn was breaking, the first light creeping over the horizon, turning the sky a pale, uncertain grey. I pulled into a gas station, parked under the harsh glow of the fluorescent lights, and finally let out a shaky breath. Claire turned to me, her voice small, like she was afraid of the answer. "Do you think it was a person?" I shook my head, staring out into the empty parking lot, my mind replaying the sight of those eyes in the flashlight beam, the strange, hunched shape that had moved faster than anything I'd ever seen. "I don't know what it was," I said, the words catching in my throat, "but it wasn't human. We never went back to that lake. We tried to forget, to convince ourselves that it was just a trick of the light, a trick of our tired minds. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night when the wind rustles the trees outside our window, I think I hear it again, the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps, moving through the darkness, searching. And I remember the way those eyes glinted back at me, watching from the shadows, and I know that whatever it was, it's still out there." Waiting. Story 12. I've been a hunter for 30 years, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found in those woods. What started as a routine tracking expedition turned into a nightmare that would forever change my understanding of the wild and of my place in it. My name is Mark Hawkins, and I've spent most of my life in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. I know these woods like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. But on that crisp autumn morning, as the mist clung to the forest floor and the early sunlight filtered through the canopy, I stumbled upon something that defied explanation. It was supposed to be a simple scouting trip. Deer season was approaching, and I was checking my usual spots, looking for signs of a good-sized buck. I'd been out since before dawn, moving quietly through the underbrush, my senses attuned to the forest around me. The first hint that something was off came when I realized how quiet it was. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I've experienced this kind of silence before, usually when a predator is nearby, but this felt different, heavier, more ominous. I was about to turn back to try my luck in a different area when I saw it, At first, I thought it was a fallen tree, its pale trunk stark against the dark forest floor. But as I got closer, I realized what I was looking at, and my blood ran cold. It was a deer carcass, but like no kill I'd ever seen before. The animal had been torn apart, its body twisted and mangled in ways that defied natural predation. I've seen what bears can do, what mountain lions leave behind. This was something else entirely. As a hunter, I'm no stranger to death in the wilderness, but this was violence on a different scale. The deer's ribcage had been split open, its organs scattered across the forest floor. But it was the precision of some of the cuts that truly unnerved me. This wasn't just an animal attack. There was intelligence behind this kill, a methodical cruelty that sent a shiver down my spine. I crouched down to examine the carcass more closely, my hand instinctively going to the hunting knife at my belt. That's when I saw the tracks. They led away from the kill site, deep impressions in the soft earth. At first glance, they looked almost human, but much larger, with clear claw marks at the ends of each toe. I've tracked every animal in these woods, but I'd never seen prints like these before. My heart was pounding now, a mix of fear and excitement coursing through my veins. Part of me knew I should leave, report what I'd found to the Forest Service, but the tracker in me, the hunter, couldn't resist. I had to know what had done this. I began to follow the tracks, moving as quietly as I could through the underbrush. They led deeper into the forest, into areas I rarely ventured. The trees here were older, gnarled and twisted, their branches blocking out most of the sunlight. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of decay and something else, something musky and animal that I couldn't quite place. As I pushed through a particularly dense thicket, I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my hand going to the rifle slung over my shoulder, but before I could even think about raising it, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Something huge was moving through the trees to my left, just at the edge of my vision. I caught glimpses of dark fur, of a massive, hunched form that moved with surprising grace for its size. And then I saw its eyes. They were amber, glowing in the dim forest light, and unmistakably intelligent. This was no mindless beast. Whatever I was looking at, it was aware, and it was watching me. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stared at each other. I could hear its breathing, heavy and rhythmic, could smell its wild, musky scent. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that would be a death sentence. Whatever this creature was, it was faster than me, stronger than me. My only hope was to stay still and pray it would lose interest. Slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, the creature began to move. It circled around me, always staying just out of clear sight, a shadow among shadows. I could feel its gaze on me, assessing, calculating. This, I realized with a chill, was what it felt like to be prey. As it moved, I got a better look at it. It was tall, at least 8 feet, covered in thick, matted fur. Its body was powerfully built, with long arms that nearly reached the ground, but it was its face that truly terrified me. Not quite human, not quite animal, with a protruding jaw full of sharp teeth and eyes that held an intelligence that was anything but bestial. This was the stuff of legends, of campfire stories told to scare children, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you wanted to call it. But the reality was far more terrifying than any story could capture. Just when I thought my legs would give out from the strain of standing so still, the creature made a sound. It was something between a growl and a word, a rumbling vocalization that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the forest with a speed and silence that defied its size. I stood there for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe too loudly. When I finally gathered the courage to start making my way back, every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. The trek back to my truck was a blur of paranoia and adrenaline. I kept expecting to feel a heavy hand on my shoulder, to turn and find those intelligent, amber eyes staring at me again. But I made it back without incident, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I drove home, my mind raced. What had I seen? What should I do? I thought about reporting it, but who would believe me? I had no proof, no evidence beyond my own rattled testimony, and a part of me, a part I'm not proud of, didn't want to share what I'd seen. This was my discovery, my encounter with something beyond explanation. In the days and weeks that followed, I couldn't get the creature out of my mind. I pored over every book, every website I could find about Bigfoot and other cryptids. I compared what I'd seen to other reported sightings, finding similarities that both excited and terrified me. I went back to the woods, of course. How could I not? But things were different now. I was no longer the confident hunter, master of my domain. Now, every shadow held potential danger. Every unexplained sound sent my heart racing. I realized that I had become what I had spent my life pursuing, prey, always alert, always watching for danger. But along with the fear came a newfound respect for the wilderness. The forest was no longer just a place for me to exert my will, to prove my skill as a hunter. It was a realm of mysteries, of creatures and forces beyond my understanding. I never saw the creature again, at least not clearly, but sometimes, when I'm deep in the woods, I catch a glimpse of movement just at the edge of my vision. I hear a twig snap behind me, or catch a whiff of that musky animal scent, and I know I'm not alone. I still hunt, still spend my days in the forest, but now I move with more caution, more reverence. I've learned that there are things in this world that defy explanation, that challenge everything we think we know. And I've learned that sometimes the hunter can become the hunted. The woods hold many secrets, and I was privileged, or perhaps cursed, to glimpse one of them. It changed me, changed how I see the world and my place in it. And every time I step into the forest now, I'm aware that I'm not just observing the wilderness, I'm being observed in return. As I sit here, writing this down, I can't help but glance out my window at the line of trees at the edge of my property. Are you out there, I wonder? Are you watching even now? And what other mysteries are lurking in the dark hollows and deep shadows of the forest, waiting to be discovered? The wilderness is vast, and we are not alone. That's the lesson I learned on that autumn day, a lesson that will stay with me for the rest of my life. And sometimes, in the dead of night when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself listening for that low, rumbling growl that's somewhere between animal and human, and wondering when I might hear it again. Story 13. I've always felt a pull toward dark, hidden places, the kind that most people avoid. The narrow, winding paths through the forest, the abandoned mines that dotted the old mountain ranges, the caves carved into the earth like scars. There's something about them that makes me feel small in a way that's comforting. But the day I found that hidden cave, with its entrance barely visible behind a thick tangle of brush, I knew right away that something was different. That place had a kind of silence that swallowed sound, and when I crossed its threshold, it felt like stepping into the mouth of something that should have stayed closed. I was out alone that day, scouting new caves for a spelunking group I sometimes guided on weekends. The sun was high, the air was cool, and the leaves crunched under my boots as I hiked through the dense forest. I'd been following the flow of a stream that had almost dried up after the summer drought, its bed a twisting trail of stones and roots. It led me into a part of the forest I hadn't been to before, where the trees grew closer together, their branches tangled overhead, cutting off most of the light. That's when I spotted it, a dark patch in the rock face, half hidden by a thick curtain of vines and moss. It was small, barely a gap between the rocks, but there was something about it that tugged at my curiosity. I cleared away the vegetation with my hands, revealing a narrow opening just big enough for me to squeeze through. The air that seeped out was cool and damp, carrying the earthy smell of stone and decay. I should have turned back right then. Every sensible part of my mind was screaming that caves like this could be unstable, that I didn't have my proper gear, that no one knew where I was. But the pull was too strong, like something inside that darkness was calling to me. So I pulled out my flashlight, took a deep breath, and ducked inside. The first thing I noticed was how smooth the walls were, as if they'd been worn down by water over centuries, leaving a tunnel that sloped gently downward. The air was still and heavy, pressing against my ears in that way it does when you go deep underground. My footsteps echoed strangely, like the sound was being absorbed by the stone. The light from my flashlight cut a narrow path through the dark, revealing only the next few feet in front of me. After a few minutes, the passage widened into a small chamber, and that's when I saw them. Deep scratches gouged into the stone walls, crisscrossing in strange, erratic patterns. I crouched down to get a better look, running my fingers over the marks. They were old, the edges worn smooth, but they looked too deliberate to be a natural formation. The claw-like pattern made my skin crawl. I moved the flashlight beam around the chamber, and that's when it caught on something else. Piles of bones, small and scattered, arranged in a loose circle in the center of the chamber. I froze, my heart suddenly hammering in my chest. They looked like animal bones, picked clean and dry, but there was something disturbingly intentional about the way they had been arranged. It was as if someone or something had placed them there, forming a kind of ritual pattern. A cold draught blew through the chamber, sending a shiver down my spine, and I fought the urge to turn around and leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trespassing on something ancient, something that didn't want to be disturbed. But again, that inexplicable pull kept me rooted in place. I told myself that the bones were probably just the work of an animal, a scavenger dragging its kills into the cave. That's when I heard it. A low, deep noise that rumbled through the chamber, so soft that at first I thought it was my imagination. It came again, vibrating through the floor like a distant growl or the shifting of massive stones. My flashlight flickered, the beam wavering as my hands started to shake. I swept the light across the chamber, half expecting to see something emerging from the darkness. But there was nothing. Just those strange claw marks on the walls and the ring of bones at my feet. The noise stopped, leaving the air even thicker, heavier. I took a step back, and that's when my boot hit something, a loose stone that shifted under my weight with a grinding sound. The floor beneath me seemed to lurch, like the ground itself was moving. The flashlight slipped from my hand, spinning as it clattered across the stone, throwing wild shadows across the chamber. For a moment, I thought I was going to fall through the floor, like some old adventure movie, but the ground held. My flashlight settled a few feet away, its beam illuminating a part of the chamber I hadn't seen before. That's when I noticed the entrance. Not the one I'd come through, but another opening, at the far side of the chamber, half sealed by a collapsed wall of rocks. The gap was small, but just wide enough for something to have squeezed through. A cold, sour smell wafted from it, like rotten meat and stagnant water. I retrieved my flashlight, hands still trembling, and shone it into the gap. What I saw made my breath catch. More scratches, deep, parallel gouges, leading from the collapsed entrance into the main chamber, like something had clawed its way in or out. And there, just beyond the beam's reach, a shadow shifted. I stumbled back, nearly falling over the bones behind me, my mind racing. The rational part of me screamed that it was just my imagination, that shadows play tricks in the dark, but every instinct I had told me to run. I spun around, aiming my flashlight back toward the way I'd come, but the beam barely cut through the darkness. The low rumble returned, louder this time, a growl that seemed to resonate through the stone, filling my chest with a deep, primal dread. I bolted. I ran back up the passageway, my boots slipping on the damp rock, the beam of my flashlight swinging wildly in front of me. The walls seemed to close in as I sprinted, the air growing colder with each step, that growl following me, growing louder, like something massive was moving through the darkness behind me. When I reached the entrance, I practically threw myself through the opening, scrambling out into the daylight. I collapsed onto the forest floor, gasping for breath, the cold air burning my lungs. For a long moment, I just lay there, staring up at the sky, listening to the ordinary sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the distant call of a bird. It wasn't until I managed to sit up, heart still racing, that I dared to look back at the cave. The entrance gaped like a wound in the earth, the darkness beyond it thick and impenetrable. But there, just inside the shadowed mouth, I thought I saw movement, something shifting, just beyond the reach of the light, pulling back into the blackness. I didn't stick around to see more. I grabbed my gear, my hands still shaking, and practically ran back down the trail, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The woods seemed different, the shadows deeper, the silence more oppressive, as if the forest itself had changed while I was underground. I made it back to my truck in record time, barely registering the scratches that lined my arms or the mud that caked my boots. I locked the doors behind me, turned the engine over, and peeled out of there, leaving the trailhead and the hidden cave far behind. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that growl, feeling the weight of those eyes that I hadn't seen but somehow knew were there, watching me from the darkness. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I'd let my imagination get the best of me, but deep down, I knew better. I knew that whatever had made those claw marks, whatever had left that circle of bones, was still out there, lurking in the dark. The next day, I thought about reporting the cave to the Park Service, telling them about the unstable ground, the strange scratches. But something stopped me. A nagging fear that they'd go looking, that they'd open that sealed entrance and find whatever was hiding behind it, or worse, that they wouldn't find anything at all, and I'd be left alone with the knowledge of what I'd seen. Now, weeks later, I still wake up some nights with that growl ringing in my ears, the memory of that shadow moving in the corner of my vision. I haven't gone back to that part of the forest. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, when the wind blows through the trees just right, I catch a faint scent on the air, cold and sour, like rotten meat, and I wonder if the cave remembers me, if it's waiting for me to come back, and I know, deep down, that some places were meant to stay hidden. Story 14. The moment my flashlight flickered and died, I knew I was in trouble. The pitch-black forest around me seemed to come alive with sounds and movements I'd never noticed before. That's when I realized I wasn't alone out here, and whatever was with me wasn't human. My name is Jennifer Carson, and I'm an experienced hiker and night sky photographer. I've spent countless nights in the wilderness, capturing the beauty of star-filled skies far from city lights. But on this moonless night in the dense forests of the Cascade Mountains, I encountered something that shattered my perception of reality and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It had started as a routine expedition. I'd heard about a particularly dark sky area deep in the national forest, perfect for capturing the Milky Way. I'd set out in the late afternoon, timing my hike to reach my chosen spot just as true darkness fell. The trail was challenging, but nothing I couldn't handle. As the last light faded from the sky, I switched on my headlamp and continued my journey. The forest at night has always held a special magic for me. The way the trees loom larger in the darkness, the rustle of nocturnal creatures going about their business, the fresh, crisp scent of pine and earth, it all combined to create an atmosphere of mystery and wonder that I loved. I reached my intended location around 10 p.m. It was a small clearing on a ridge, offering a perfect view of the sky. I set up my camera and tripod, then settled in for a long night of photography. The stars were spectacular, more brilliant than I'd ever seen them. I lost myself in the work, adjusting settings, capturing long exposures, marveling at the cosmic display above me. It must have been around midnight when I first noticed something was off. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet. No rustling leaves, no hooting owls, not even the buzz of insects. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. I paused in my work, suddenly aware of how exposed I was in the small clearing. My headlamp illuminated only a small area around me, leaving the rest of the world shrouded in impenetrable darkness. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart began to race. I'd encountered wildlife before, bears, cougars, but this sound was like nothing I'd ever heard. It was deep, primal, and unmistakably threatening. I quickly packed up my camera gear, deciding it was time to get out of there. But as I turned to head back down the trail, my headlamp flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. Panic surged through me. I always carried spare batteries, but they were in my backpack. I fumbled in the darkness, trying to find the zipper, acutely aware of every sound around me. Branches creaked in the light breeze, leaves rustled underfoot, and somewhere, not too far away, I could hear heavy footsteps. Finally, I managed to get my backpack open and locate the spare batteries. My hands shook as I tried to replace them in the headlamp, but no matter what I did, it wouldn't turn on. Something was wrong with the lamp itself. I still had my flashlight, a heavy-duty model that I kept for emergencies. I pulled it out and switched it on, relief flooding through me as its beam cut through the darkness. But that relief was short-lived. In the flashlight's glow, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the soft earth of the clearing, footprints that hadn't been there when I arrived. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot, with distinct claw marks at the end of each toe. I swung the flashlight around wildly, searching the tree line for any sign of movement. That's when I heard the growl again, much closer this time. And in the split second before my flashlight died, I saw it. A massive figure, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur. But it wasn't the size that terrified me most. It was the eyes. Glowing amber in the flashlight's beam, filled with an intelligence that was anything but animal. Then I was plunged into total darkness. The thing, I couldn't bring myself to name it, let out a roar that shook me to my core. I did the only thing I could. I ran. I had no idea where I was going. The trail I'd followed up was lost to me in the darkness. I simply ran, crashing through underbrush, stumbling over roots and rocks, branches whipping at my face. Behind me, I could hear it giving chase, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. But still I pushed on, driven by a primal fear I'd never experienced before. I was no longer a modern human, with all the trappings of civilization. I was prey, being hunted by a predator far stronger and faster than me. In my panic, I lost all sense of direction. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches clawing at my clothes, roots reaching up to trip me. Every shadow held potential danger, every sound a possible threat. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in the darkness and fear. But eventually, I burst out of the trees and found myself on the edge of a steep ravine. Far below, I could see the glimmer of water, a river or large stream. I was trapped. To my left and right, the ravine stretched into darkness. Behind me, I could hear the creature approaching, its growls growing louder. I had a split second to make a decision. I jumped. The fall seemed to last forever. I tumbled down the steep slope, unable to control my descent, rocks and branches battering my body. Then I hit the water, the cold shock nearly stealing the breath from my lungs. The current was strong, pulling me downstream. I fought to keep my head above water, gasping for air. Above me, on the ridge where I'd jumped, I saw a massive silhouette outlined against the starry sky. Its roar of frustration echoed off the canyon walls as the river carried me swiftly away. I don't know how long I was in the water. Eventually, I managed to grab onto a low-hanging branch and pull myself to shore. I lay there on the riverbank, soaked and shivering, every part of my body aching from the fall and the wild ride downstream. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of my situation set in. I was lost, injured, and alone in the wilderness. My backpack with all my gear was gone, lost in the mad dash through the forest or in the river. I had no food, no water, no means of communication, but I was alive, and whatever that thing was, it was far behind me now. As the first light of dawn began to brighten the sky, I started walking, following the river downstream. I knew that eventually it had to lead to civilization. It was late afternoon when I finally stumbled onto a road. A passing motorist stopped and called for help. I was taken to a hospital, treated for exposure and minor injuries. When they asked what had happened, I told them I'd gotten lost and fallen into the river. How could I explain the truth? In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I researched cryptids, read about Bigfoot sightings in the area. I found myself looking at every shadow with suspicion, jumping at every unexpected sound. I haven't gone back to those woods. Not yet, but I know I will. Because despite the terror of that night, or perhaps because of it, I'm drawn to the mystery. What was that creature? How many of them are out there? And what other secrets does the wilderness hold? My experience changed me. It showed me that the world is bigger, stranger, and more dangerous than I ever imagined, but it also filled me with a sense of wonder, because if something like that can exist, undiscovered in our modern world, what else might be out there? As I sit here, looking out my window at the distant mountains, I can't help but feel a mix of fear and excitement. The wilderness is no longer just a playground for my photography. It's a realm of mystery and danger, of creatures beyond our understanding. And someday, when I've gathered my courage, I'll go back. I'll venture into those dark woods again, camera in hand. But this time, I'll be looking for more than just stars in the night sky. I'll be searching for answers to questions I never knew to ask before that terrifying night when the darkness fell and the hunter became the hunted. Story 15. I never believed in monsters until I became a forest ranger. Now, I'm not so sure what to believe anymore. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I've been working as a ranger in the Cascade Mountains for the past 3 years. I've always loved the outdoors, the smell of pine needles, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the peaceful solitude that comes with being surrounded by nature. But that night in October changed everything. It was a typical autumn evening, crisp and cool, with a light mist hanging in the air. The forest was quieter than usual, which should have been my first clue that something was off. I was doing my final rounds before turning in for the night, checking the perimeter of my assigned area near Shadow Lake. As I walked along the well-worn path, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, I heard a sound that made me stop in my tracks. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. My first thought was that it might be a bear, but deep down, I knew this was different. I swept my flashlight across the tree line, searching for the source of the noise. The beam caught a pair of eyes reflecting back at me, much higher off the ground than any normal animal should be. My heart began to race as I fumbled for the radio at my belt, but before I could call for backup, the eyes disappeared. Trying to calm my nerves, I continued my patrol, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me jump. I quickened my pace, eager to get back to the safety of my ranger station. As I approached the clearing where my cabin stood, I noticed something odd about the ground. There, in the soft earth, were footprints. But these weren't the tracks of any animal I recognized. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own boot print, and they looked almost human. My hands shaking, I knelt down to examine the prints more closely. That's when I saw it, a tuft of coarse, dark hair caught on a nearby bramble. I plucked it free, holding it up to the light. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, too thick to be human hair, but not quite like animal fur either. I hurried inside my cabin, locking the door behind me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen and heard. I knew I should radio it in, report the strange occurrences to my superiors, but something held me back. Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself. Sleep eluded me that night. I sat by the window, peering out into the darkness, my rifle close at hand. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. And then, just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I saw it. A figure, massive and hulking, moved between the trees at the edge of the clearing. It walked on two legs, but its movements were fluid and animal-like. In the dim light, I could make out a coat of shaggy fur covering its body. My breath caught in my throat as it turned its head, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. I don't know how long we stared at each other, this impossible creature and I. Time seemed to stand still. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it melted back into the forest, leaving me to question my own sanity. The days that followed were a blur. I went through the motions of my job, patrolling the area, checking in with headquarters, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen, couldn't shake the feeling that I was being constantly observed. I began to notice other strange occurrences. Small game seemed to have vanished from the area, and the larger animals were skittish, as if something had upset the natural order of things. I found more of those massive footprints, always on the outskirts of my patrol route, as if whatever was out there was testing the boundaries. A week after that first night, I was sitting on the porch of my cabin, cleaning my rifle, when I heard it again, that deep, rumbling growl. It was closer this time, much closer. I stood up slowly, my eyes scanning the tree line. And there it was, half hidden behind a massive pine tree, watching me. In the fading light of dusk, I could see it more clearly now. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick, dark fur. Its face was a strange mix of human and animal features, with deep-set eyes that held an unsettling intelligence. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, with deliberate slowness, it stepped out from behind the tree. My hand tightened on my rifle, but I didn't raise it. Something told me that would be a mistake. The creature tilted its head, studying me with what seemed like curiosity. Then, to my utter shock, it spoke. The sound it made wasn't any language I recognized, but it was undeniably an attempt at communication. A series of low grunts and rumbles, almost like words but not quite. I stood there, frozen, as it took another step towards me. That's when my training kicked in. I backed up slowly, never taking my eyes off the creature, and reached for the door handle behind me. As soon as my hand touched the cold metal, the creature stopped its advance. We stood there, locked in a silent standoff, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I managed to find my voice. "What are you?" I whispered, not really expecting an answer. The creature's mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp teeth. For a terrifying moment, I thought it was going to charge. Instead, it let out a sound that chilled me to my core, a laugh. It was a rough, guttural sound, but unmistakably a laugh. Before I could react, it turned and loped off into the forest, moving with an agility that belied its massive size. I stood there, my heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wanted to chase after it, to demand answers. But a larger part, the part driven by self-preservation, kept me rooted to the spot. I spent that night huddled in my cabin, every creak and groan of the old wooden structure setting my nerves on edge. I knew I should report what I'd seen, but who would believe me? I'd be laughed out of the ranger service, maybe even lose my job. So I kept quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The next few weeks were a twisted game of cat and mouse. I'd catch glimpses of the creature on my patrols, always just at the edge of my vision. Sometimes I'd find signs of its presence, a tuft of fur here, a massive footprint there. It seemed to be testing me, gauging my reactions. I started leaving food out, partly as a peace offering, partly out of scientific curiosity. The first few times, the food remained untouched. Then, one morning, I found the plate licked clean. After that, it became a nightly occurrence. I'd leave out different types of food, trying to determine its preferences. Meat was always the first to go, but it seemed to have a surprising fondness for fruit as well. As the days passed, my fear began to give way to a cautious fascination. I started to look forward to our encounters, as fleeting as they were. I talked to it sometimes, when I caught sight of it in the woods. I don't know if it understood me, but it would often stop and listen, those intelligent eyes fixed on me. One night, about a month after our first encounter, I woke to the sound of something heavy moving on my porch. I grabbed my rifle and crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. There, illuminated by the pale moonlight, was the creature. It was sitting on my porch swing, the old wood creaking under its weight, looking for all the world like it belonged there. I don't know what possessed me, but I found myself opening the door and stepping out onto the porch. The creature turned its head to look at me, but made no move to leave. Slowly, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it could hear it, I sat down on the other end of the swing. We sat there in silence, this impossible being and I, watching the stars wheel overhead. After a while, it turned to me and made that series of grunts and rumbles again. This time, I could have sworn it sounded almost friendly. As the first light of dawn began to break over the mountains, the creature stood. It looked at me one last time, and I saw something in its eyes that I never expected. Recognition. Not just of me as a familiar presence, but of me as a fellow sentient being. Then, with a grace that belied its size, it melted back into the forest. I never saw the creature again after that night. Sometimes I wonder if it was all a dream, some sort of stress-induced hallucination, but then I'll find a massive footprint in a remote part of my patrol route, or hear a distant, familiar growl echoing through the trees, and I know that there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. And I know that for one brief, incredible moment, I shared a connection with one of them. I'm still a forest ranger. I still love the woods and the solitude they provide. But now, when I look out into the darkness, I see it differently. Not as an empty void, but as a place full of mysteries and wonders yet to be discovered. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I see a pair of intelligent eyes looking back at me from the shadows, reminding me that there's more to this world than we could ever imagine. Story 16. The moment I saw those claw marks on the trees, I knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary camping trip. What I didn't realize was that by nightfall, I'd be fighting not just for the safety of my group, but for our very understanding of the natural world. My name is David Callahan, and I've been leading wilderness expeditions for over 15 years. I've guided groups through some of the most challenging terrains on Earth, from the dense jungles of the Amazon to the icy peaks of the Himalayas. But nothing in my experience could have prepared me for what we encountered in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was supposed to be a routine 5-day trek, a mix of experienced hikers and newcomers, eager to test their skills in the wild. We set out early on a crisp autumn morning, the air filled with the scent of pine and the promise of adventure. The group was in high spirits, chatting and laughing as we made our way along the well-worn trail. I first noticed something was off about midday. We were taking a short break, and I was scouting ahead when I saw them, deep, parallel gouges in the bark of a massive pine tree. At first, I thought it might be bear marks, but these were too high, too wide apart. Whatever had made them was big, much bigger than any bear I'd ever encountered. A chill ran down my spine, but I pushed the feeling aside. I was responsible for the safety and enjoyment of my group. I couldn't let vague fears distract me from my duty. Still, I found myself scanning the forest more carefully as we continued our hike, my senses on high alert for any sign of danger. As the day wore on, I noticed more unsettling signs. Broken branches high up in the trees, more claw marks, and at one point, what looked like a massive footprint in a patch of mud. I did my best to keep the group's attention focused elsewhere, not wanting to alarm them unnecessarily, but I could tell some of the more experienced hikers had noticed too. I caught them exchanging worried glances, their hands straying closer to their knives or bear spray. We made camp just before sunset in a small clearing beside a babbling stream. As the group set up tents and gathered firewood, I took a moment to survey our surroundings. The forest seemed to press in around us, the trees looming taller and more menacing in the fading light. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Dinner was a subdued affair. Even the most talkative members of the group seemed to sense the tension in the air. As darkness fell, I organized the usual campfire stories and songs, trying to lighten the mood, but every rustle in the undergrowth, every snap of a twig in the darkness beyond our fire's light, made us all jump. It was just after midnight when it happened. I was on watch, sitting by the dying embers of our fire, when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite human. I was on my feet in an instant, my hand going to the large hunting knife at my belt. "Everyone up!" I called out, trying to keep my voice calm and authoritative. "Get out of your tents now!" The camp erupted into confused activity. Sleepy faces emerged from tents, questions were shouted, and fear began to spread as that inhuman growl came again, louder this time. "Form a circle, backs to the fire," I ordered, falling back on years of training. "Whatever's out there, we face it together." As the group huddled together, I saw real terror in their eyes. I knew I had to keep them calm, keep them focused, or panic would make our situation even more dangerous. "Listen to me," I said, pitching my voice to carry to everyone without shouting. "We don't know what's out there, but we're safe if we stick together. Keep your eyes on the tree line. Report anything you see or hear." For what felt like hours, we stood there, straining our eyes against the darkness. The growls continued, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, as if whatever was making them was circling our camp. Occasionally, we'd hear the crack of a branch or the rustle of leaves, but nothing ever emerged from the shadows. Then, just as the first light of dawn began to lighten the sky, all hell broke loose. It started with our supplies. Something huge crashed through our camp, scattering backpacks and tearing open food containers. In the dim, pre-dawn light, I caught glimpses of a massive, fur-covered form, moving with incredible speed. "Hold your ground!" I shouted, as some of the group made to run. "Running will only make you a target." Heart pounding, I reached for my emergency flare gun. The bright red flare shot into the sky, momentarily illuminating the clearing, and in that brief flash of light, I saw them. There were 3 of them, each at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick, matted fur. But it wasn't their size that froze the blood in my veins. It was their faces, not quite human, not quite animal, with eyes that glowed with an intelligence that was anything but bestial. The flare seemed to startle them. With speed that defied their size, they melted back into the forest, leaving only destruction and massive footprints as evidence of their presence. As the flare faded and darkness fell again, I knew I had to act fast. The group was on the verge of panic, and we were miles from any help. "Listen to me," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "What we just saw, I know it's hard to believe, but right now, we need to focus on getting out of here safely. We're going to pack up what's left of our supplies and head back to the trailhead. Stay close, stay quiet, and we'll get through this." It was a tense journey back. Every sound, every shadow made us jump. I kept the group moving at a brisk pace, pushing through their exhaustion and fear. By some miracle, we made it back to the trailhead without further incident. As we piled into our vehicles, the reality of what we'd experienced began to sink in. I could see the questions, the disbelief in their eyes. How could we explain what we'd seen? Who would believe us? In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to make sense of it all. I researched cryptids, read every account of Bigfoot sightings I could find. I compared notes with the others from the group, piecing together our fragmented memories of that terrifying night. Some of the group wanted to go public with our story, to alert the authorities. Others, myself included, were more hesitant. We had no proof beyond our own testimony, and the thought of the ridicule and disbelief we'd face was daunting. In the end, we kept it to ourselves. But the experience changed us all. How could it not? We'd glimpsed something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the natural world. I still lead expeditions. I still take groups into the wilderness. But now I do it with a newfound respect and caution, because I know that out there, in the deepest, darkest parts of the forest, there are things that defy explanation, things that remind us that for all our technology, all our knowledge, we're not as far removed from the primal world as we'd like to believe. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I think I hear that growl again. I see movement just at the edge of my vision, and I wonder, are they watching me? Are they out there, these creatures that walk the line between myth and reality? I don't have answers, but I know that the next time I venture into the wilderness, I'll be watching the shadows a little more closely, listening a little more carefully to the whispers in the pines, because now I know that we're not alone out there, and sometimes, just sometimes, the legends we dismiss as campfire stories turn out to be all too real. The wilderness is vast and full of secrets, and after that night, I realized that some of those secrets are better left undiscovered, but they're out there, waiting. And who knows, maybe someday one of those secrets will find you, just as it found us on that terrifying night in the forest. Story 17. I used to think camping was about connecting with nature. Now I know it's about surviving it. My name is Mike Thompson, and what my wife Jenny and I experienced in the Adirondack Mountains still haunts me to this day. We were avid campers, always seeking out the most remote spots to pitch our tent and escape the chaos of city life. But our last trip changed everything. It was late September, and we had found a secluded clearing deep in the heart of the forest. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the landscape in vibrant reds and golds. As we set up camp, the crisp autumn air filled our lungs, and the excitement of adventure coursed through our veins. The first day was perfect. We hiked, fished in a nearby stream, and watched the sunset paint the sky in breathtaking hues. As darkness fell, we built a campfire and roasted marshmallows, laughing and talking about our plans for the future. If only we had known then how our world was about to be turned upside down. It started with the howls. We were snuggled up in our sleeping bags when the first one pierced the night. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, not quite wolf, not quite human. It sent a chill down my spine, and I felt Jenny stiffen beside me. "Mike, what was that?" she whispered, her voice tight with fear. I tried to sound calm as I replied, "Probably just a coyote or something, nothing to worry about." But deep down, I knew this was different. The howl came again, closer this time, and was joined by others. They echoed through the trees, surrounding us, a cacophony of otherworldly sounds that made my heart race. We lay there in tense silence, listening as the howls gradually faded into the distance. Eventually, exhaustion overtook our fear, and we drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke to Jenny's panicked voice. "Mike, wake up! Something's wrong!" I scrambled out of the tent, blinking in the early morning light. What I saw made my blood run cold. Our campsite was in shambles. The cooler had been ripped open, its contents strewn across the clearing. Our backpacks were shredded, and the remnants of our food supplies lay scattered on the ground. but it was the footprints that truly terrified me. They circled our tent, massive paw prints that were far too large to belong to any normal canine, and mixed in with them were other tracks, bipedal prints that looked almost human, but elongated and with clear claw marks at the ends. Jenny stood trembling beside me, her face pale. What could have done this? I shook my head, unable to form words. My mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Whatever had visited our camp in the night was no ordinary animal. We spent the morning salvaging what we could of our supplies and debating what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but another part, the stubborn, rational part, insisted that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was just some bears, I said, trying to convince myself as much as Jenny. We'll secure our food better tonight and make a bigger fire. It'll be fine. Jenny didn't look convinced, but she nodded. We both knew that with our food supplies decimated and our car miles away, we didn't have much choice but to stay another night. As dusk approached, the forest seemed to close in around us. The friendly chirping of birds gave way to eerie silence, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig that made us both jump. We built our fire higher than usual, hoping its light would keep away whatever had visited us the night before. We sat close together, barely talking, every sense on high alert. The night wore on, and slowly, cautiously, we began to relax. Maybe it had just been a one-time thing. Maybe we were safe. Then we heard it, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush. Something was circling our campsite, just beyond the reach of our firelight. Jenny clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. I reached for the hunting knife at my belt, knowing it would be useless against whatever was out there, but needing to feel some sense of protection. A low growl rumbled through the clearing, raising the hair on the back of my neck. I caught a glimpse of movement, a large, dark shape slipping between the trees. Then another, and another. "Mike," Jenny whispered, her voice trembling, "we need to run." But I knew running would be suicide. Whatever these creatures were, they were faster than us, knew the terrain better than us. Our only hope was to stay put and pray the fire would keep them at bay. For hours, we sat frozen in terror as the creatures stalked around our camp. Occasionally, we'd see glowing eyes reflecting the firelight, or hear a series of yips and growls that sounded disturbingly like communication. As the first light of dawn began to break, the noises gradually faded away. We waited, hardly daring to breathe, until the sun was fully up before we moved. The campsite was once again in disarray, but this time something was different. There, scratched deep into the trunk of a nearby tree, were 3 long, parallel claw marks. Jenny burst into tears, the stress of the night finally overwhelming her. I held her close, my mind racing. We had to get out of here now. We packed up what little we had left and started the long trek back to our car. Every rustle in the bushes, every snapping twig made us flinch. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, followed. About halfway to the trailhead, we found the first body. It was a deer, or what was left of one. Its carcass had been torn apart with savage force, the ground around it soaked with blood. Jenny retched at the sight, and I felt my own stomach churn. We picked up our pace, no longer caring about stealth. Whatever had killed that deer was still out here, and I had a sickening feeling it had developed a taste for larger prey. The forest seemed to be closing in on us, the trees looming overhead, blocking out the sunlight. Strange noises echoed in the distance. Was that a howl, or just the wind? Were those footsteps following us, or just our own echoing back? We were about a mile from the car when we heard it. A long, mournful howl that was quickly joined by others. They were behind us, and they were getting closer. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Jenny's hand. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. The howls grew louder, accompanied now by the sound of heavy bodies moving swiftly through the forest. I could see the parking lot ahead, our car a beacon of safety. We were going to make it. We had to make it. 50 yards. I could hear panting behind us, getting closer. 30 yards. A snarl, so close it made my heart stop. 10 yards. I fumbled for the car keys, praying I wouldn't drop them. We reached the car, and I all but threw Jenny inside before diving in myself. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn it. The engine roared to life just as something heavy slammed into the driver's side door. I floored it, tires squealing as we fishtailed out of the parking lot. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of several large, dark shapes at the edge of the trees. They were like wolves, but bigger, with an almost human-like posture. One of them reared up on its hind legs and let out a bone-chilling howl before the others melted back into the forest. We drove in silence, both of us too shocked to speak. It wasn't until we were back on the main highway that Jenny finally broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. I pulled over and held her, my own eyes wet with tears of relief and lingering fear. We never went camping again after that. How could we, knowing what was out there in the wilderness? We told our story to the park rangers, but they dismissed it as an encounter with unusually aggressive wolves. But we knew the truth. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear those howls in my dreams. I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, and I have to remind myself that I'm safe in my bed, far away from those dark forests. But a part of me knows that they're still out there, those creatures that lurk in the shadows between our world and something else. And I can't help but wonder, how long before they decide to venture beyond the forests? So if you're planning a camping trip to some remote location, think twice. And if you do go, and you hear strange howls in the night, don't convince yourself it's just the wind. Run, run, and don't look back, because there are some things in this world that aren't meant to be understood, only survived. Story 18. They say the journey is more important than the destination. But when the journey leads you into the heart of an ancient nightmare, sometimes the only destination that matters is survival. My name is Alex Reeves, and I was one of 5 hikers who ventured into the Appalachian Mountains last summer. What began as an exciting trek through unexplored terrain turned into a desperate fight for survival against something we never should have encountered. Our group consisted of myself, my best friend Tom, his girlfriend Sarah, and our college buddies Mike and Lisa. We were all experienced hikers, but nothing could have prepared us for what awaited us in those remote mountains. The trouble started on our 3rd day out. We had veered off the main trail, following an old map Tom had found online that promised to lead us to a series of hidden waterfalls. In retrospect, we should have known better than to trust an unverified source, but the allure of discovering something new was too strong to resist. As the day wore on, it became clear we were lost. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, and the markers on Tom's map no longer matched our surroundings. A sense of unease settled over the group as the sun began to dip below the tree line. "We should make camp," Sarah suggested, her voice tight with barely concealed worry. "We can try to find our bearings in the morning." We all agreed, too exhausted to argue. As we set up our tents, a thick mist began to roll in, obscuring the forest around us. The temperature dropped rapidly, and an eerie silence fell over the woods. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals, just an oppressive quiet that seemed to press in on us from all sides. It was Mike who first noticed the cave. "Hey guys, look at this," he called out, pointing to a dark opening in the side of a nearby cliff face. "Maybe we can shelter in there for the night. It'll be warmer than the tents." We approached the cave cautiously. It was larger than it had first appeared, the entrance easily big enough for us to walk through upright. The interior was cool and dry, a welcome respite from the damp mist outside. "This is perfect," Lisa said, shining her flashlight around the cavern. "We can set up camp in here and—" Her words cut off abruptly as the beam of her flashlight illuminated the far wall of the cave. We all stood frozen, staring in disbelief at what we saw. The wall was covered in ancient paintings. Crude figures of humans and animals danced across the rock surface, telling a story we couldn't quite decipher. But it was the central image that sent a chill down my spine. A massive, looming figure, half human and half beast, with antlers sprouting from its head and claws as long as a man's arm. "What the hell is that?" Tom whispered, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. Before anyone could answer, a low rumble shook the cave. At first, I thought it was an earthquake, but then I realized the sound was coming from deeper within the cavern. "Guys," Sarah said, her voice trembling, "I think we should get out of here." But as we turned to leave, we found our exit blocked. The mist had thickened into an impenetrable wall of white, and beyond it, we could hear something moving, something big. "Back!" I hissed, ushering everyone deeper into the cave. "We need to find another way out." We stumbled through the darkness, our flashlights casting jerky shadows on the walls. The rumbling grew louder, punctuated now by what sounded disturbingly like footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that shook loose small cascades of pebbles from the cave ceiling. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the mountain. The air grew colder, and a musty animal smell filled our nostrils. We tried to keep quiet, but our ragged breathing and the scuff of our boots on the rocky floor seemed deafening in the enclosed space. After what felt like hours, we emerged into a larger cavern. Our flashlights barely penetrated the darkness, but we could make out multiple tunnels branching off in different directions. "Which way?" Lisa asked, panic evident in her voice. Before anyone could answer, a bone-chilling howl echoed through the cavern. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, part wolf, part human, and entirely terrifying. "Run!" I yelled, no longer caring about stealth. We bolted down the nearest tunnel, our hearts pounding in our ears. The howl came again, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of something large crashing through the cave behind us. We ran blindly, taking turns at random, driven by pure animal instinct to escape. The creature, whatever it was gaining on us. I could hear its heavy breathing, the scrape of claws on stone. Suddenly, Mike let out a strangled cry. I turned to see him being dragged backwards into the darkness, his flashlight spinning away across the cave floor. "Mike!" Sarah screamed, but Tom held her back. "We can't help him," he said, his face ashen in the dim light. "We have to keep moving." The guilt of leaving Mike behind ate at me, but I knew Tom was right. We pressed on, our group now down to 4. The tunnel began to slope upward, giving us a faint hope that we might be nearing the surface. But then we hit a dead end, a smooth rock face with no way forward. "No, no, no," Lisa muttered, running her hands over the wall as if hoping to find a hidden passage. The creature's growls were getting closer. We pressed ourselves against the wall, flashlights pointed at the tunnel we'd just come through. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, clutching Tom's arm. I fumbled in my pack, my hand closing around the flare gun I always carried for emergencies. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. The creature appeared at the mouth of the tunnel, and for the first time we got a clear look at it. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, with the body of a man but covered in thick, matted fur. Its head was that of a deer, complete with a massive rack of antlers, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural, intelligent malevolence. Time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other, 4 terrified humans and this impossible being. Then it let out another of those bone-chilling howls and charged. I raised the flare gun and fired. The cavern erupted in blinding red light. The creature reared back, letting out a screech of pain and anger. "There!" Tom shouted, pointing to a narrow crevice in the rock wall that the flare had illuminated. "We can fit through there." We squeezed through the opening one by one, the sound of the creature's enraged roars spurring us on. The passage was tight, the rough stones scraping our skin as we pushed through. After what felt like an eternity, we tumbled out onto a forested slope. The early morning light was just starting to filter through the trees, and I've never been so glad to see the sky in my life. We didn't stop running until we reached a ranger station hours later. We told them about Mike, about the cave, about the creature. They sent out search parties, but they never found any trace of Mike or the cave entrance. It was as if the mountain had swallowed it all up. The official report chalked it up to a bear attack and hallucinations brought on by fear and exhaustion. But we know what we saw. That thing in the cave wasn't a bear, wasn't anything that should exist in our world. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that howl in my dreams. I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, half expecting to see antlers silhouetted against my bedroom wall. We never went hiking again after that. How could we, knowing what's out there in the dark places of the world? So let this be a warning to all you adventurers and thrill seekers. Stick to the marked trails, because sometimes when you venture into the unknown ventures back. And not all mysteries are meant to be solved. Some are meant to be fled from with every ounce of strength you have. Story 19. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but sometimes the story behind the picture is worth your life. My name is Tom Hawkins, and I've been a wildlife photographer for over a decade. I've captured images of some of the world's most elusive creatures in their natural habitats, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest last autumn. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, a 2-week solo expedition to photograph the local wildlife for a nature magazine. I'd done dozens of similar trips before, and I was looking forward to the solitude and the chance to immerse myself in nature. The first few days were uneventful. I got some great shots of elk, a family of black bears, and even a rarely seen fisher. But it was on the 4th night that everything changed. I was reviewing the day's photos on my camera when I noticed something strange in the background of one of the shots. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or maybe a blurred tree trunk. But as I zoomed in, my blood ran cold. There, partially obscured by foliage, was a figure. It was tall, much taller than a man, and covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. Its proportions were all wrong, with long arms that nearly reached the ground, and a head that seemed to sit directly on its shoulders with no visible neck. I told myself it had to be a bear standing on its hind legs, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Bears don't stand like that, and they certainly don't have the distinctly humanoid shape this creature possessed. Sleep eluded me that night. I kept replaying the image in my mind, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it was nothing more than a strange shadow or a flaw in the camera's sensor. But then I found the tracks. They were enormous, easily twice the size of my own boot prints, and they looked disturbingly human-like, albeit with clear claw marks at the ends of the toes. They led from the edge of my campsite into the dense undergrowth of the forest. My rational mind screamed at me to pack up and leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But the part of me that had become a photographer, the part that always sought the perfect shot, no matter the cost, whispered that this could be the discovery of a lifetime. I decided to follow the tracks. The trail led me deeper into the forest than I'd ever ventured before. The trees grew thicker, blocking out most of the sunlight and creating a perpetual twilight beneath the canopy. The air grew colder and damper, and an oppressive silence settled over everything. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me whirl around, my camera at the ready. But each time I saw nothing but the endless sea of green and brown. It was late afternoon when I found the clearing. The tracks led right up to its edge before disappearing into the tall grass. And there, in the center of the clearing, was a structure that made my heart skip a beat. It looked like a crude shelter, made of broken tree branches and leaves, but it was huge, far larger than anything a human would need. Next to it was a pile of bones, deer mostly, but I spotted what looked disturbingly like a human skull mixed in. I raised my camera with shaking hands, determined to document what I was seeing. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, my finger instinctively pressing the shutter button. For a split second, I saw it clearly through my viewfinder. A massive, ape-like face with deep-set eyes that glowed with an unsettling intelligence. Then it was gone, melting back into the shadows of the forest with a speed that belied its size. Panic overtook me. I ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or stealth. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me at every step, but I didn't slow down. I could hear it moving through the forest behind me, keeping pace effortlessly. As I ran, I became aware of other sounds, whoops and howls coming from different directions. There was more than one of them, and they were coordinating, trying to cut off my escape. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that green hell. But eventually, I burst out of the tree line and onto a logging road. I flagged down a passing truck, babbling incoherently about monsters in the woods. The driver, a kind-faced older man, took one look at my wild eyes and tear-streaked face and decided not to ask questions. He drove me straight to the nearest town. I spent the next few days holed up in a motel room, jumping at every sound and keeping the curtains tightly drawn. When I finally worked up the courage to look at the photos on my camera, my hands shook so badly I could barely operate the buttons. Most of the images were blurry, useless smears of green and brown. But one photo, the last one I'd taken, was crystal clear. It showed a face that haunts my nightmares to this day, not quite ape, not quite human, with eyes that held a depth of awareness that chilled me to my core. I deleted the photo immediately. Some truths are too dangerous to share with the world. In the years since that day, I've tried to convince myself that it was all a hallucination, a product of isolation and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I know the truth. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that exist in the shadowy spaces between what we know and what we fear to know. I still work as a photographer, but I stick to urban environments now. The call of the wild no longer holds any appeal for me, because I know that sometimes, when you look into the heart of nature, something looks back. And not all gazes are meant to be met. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened in those woods. Until now. Consider this a warning to all you adventurers and thrill-seekers out there. When you're in the wilderness, and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you you're being watched, trust your instincts. Don't go looking for the watcher, because you might just find it. And if you do, pray that you're faster than I was. Pray that you can outrun not just the creature, but the curiosity that makes you want to turn around and look. Because once you've seen it, truly seen it, you'll never be the same. Sometimes the best shot is the one you don't take. Sometimes the only winning move is not to play. And sometimes the most important story is the one you never tell. So the next time you're out in the woods, and you hear something moving in the undergrowth that sounds a little too big, a little too deliberate to be just another animal, don't reach for your camera. Don't try to be a hero. Just run, and don't look back. Because there are some mysteries in this world that are better left unsolved, some creatures that should remain undiscovered. And trust me when I say, no photograph is worth your life. Story 20. They say home is where the heart is. But what happens when your temporary home becomes a prison, and the wilderness around you holds terrors beyond imagination? My name is Jack Thompson, and what my family and I experienced during our camping trip in the Ozarks still sends chills down my spine. It was supposed to be a fun, week-long getaway, a chance for us to bond and enjoy nature. Instead, it turned into a nightmare that nearly cost us everything. There were 4 of us on this trip: myself, my wife Linda, our 14-year-old daughter Emily, and our 10-year-old son Max. We'd found a secluded campsite, miles from the nearest town, nestled in a picturesque valley surrounded by dense forest. It was perfect, or so we thought. The first 2 days were idyllic. We hiked, fished in the nearby stream, and gathered around the campfire each night to roast marshmallows and tell stories. The kids were having a blast, and Linda and I felt more relaxed than we had in years. It was on the 3rd night that everything changed. We'd all turned in early, exhausted from a day of exploring. I was on the edge of sleep when I heard it, a scream that sounded almost human, but not quite. It echoed through the valley, setting my heart racing. "Jack," Linda whispered beside me, her voice tight with fear. "What was that?" "Probably just a mountain lion," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But deep down, I knew this was different. The sound had an otherworldly quality that made my skin crawl. We lay there in tense silence, straining our ears. Then it came again, closer this time, followed by a series of yips and howls that sounded like nothing I'd ever heard before. The kids woke up, frightened by the noise. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in our tent, listening as the strange cries circled our campsite. None of us slept a wink. When morning finally came, we emerged from our tent to find our campsite in disarray. Our cooler had been overturned, its contents strewn across the ground. Deep claw marks scored the sides of our car, and large, unidentifiable tracks circled our tent. "We need to leave," Linda said, her face pale. "Now." I couldn't have agreed more. We hastily packed up our gear, the kids unusually quiet as they helped. But when I tried to start the car, my blood ran cold. The engine sputtered and died. "What's wrong, Dad?" Max asked, his voice small and scared. I popped the hood, dreading what I might find. Sure enough, several wires had been torn out, rendering the car useless. Whatever had visited us in the night hadn't wanted us to leave. "It's okay," I said, forcing a smile. "We'll just have to hike out. It's not too far to the main road." But as we gathered our backpacks and prepared to leave, we heard it again, that chilling, not quite human scream. It was coming from the direction we needed to go, and it was joined by others, many others. Linda grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Jack, we can't go out there." She was right. Whatever was making those sounds, there were too many of them, and they were between us and safety. We were trapped. We spent the day in a state of tense vigilance, jumping at every sound. I tried to repair the car, but without the proper tools or parts, it was hopeless. Our cell phones had no signal. We were well and truly cut off. As night fell, the noises started again. Howls and screams echoed through the trees, punctuated by the sound of heavy bodies moving through the underbrush. We huddled in our tent, the kids crying quietly as Linda and I tried to comfort them. "What are they, Dad?" Emily whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I wished I had an answer for her. The rational part of my mind insisted they had to be some kind of animal, maybe a pack of coyotes or wolves, but the sounds they made, they were like nothing I'd ever heard in nature documentaries or on our previous camping trips. Around midnight, something large brushed against the side of our tent. We all froze, hardly daring to breathe. I could hear deep, ragged breathing just inches away from us, separated only by the thin fabric of the tent. Then, to our horror, a clawed hand, far too large and misshapen to be human, pressed against the tent wall. The outline was clear in the moonlight, and I felt a scream building in my throat. Just as suddenly as it appeared, the hand withdrew. We heard heavy footsteps moving away, accompanied by a series of low grunts that sounded disturbingly like language. None of us slept that night. We sat in terrified silence, listening to the creatures move around our campsite. Occasionally, we'd hear the sound of something being torn apart. Our supplies, I realized with a sinking heart. When dawn finally broke, the noises faded away. We cautiously emerged from our tent to survey the damage. Our campsite looked like a war zone. Everything that could be destroyed had been: our food, our extra clothes, even our backup flashlights. But it was what we found at the edge of our campsite that truly chilled me to the bone. There, Scratched deep into the trunk of a massive oak tree were 3 parallel claw marks, and below them, arranged in a crude pile, were bones. Some were clearly animal, but others looked disturbingly human. "We have to get out of here," Linda said, her voice shaking. "We have to try." I nodded, swallowing hard. "Kids, grab only what you absolutely need. We're leaving. Now." We set off down the trail, moving as quietly as we could. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made us flinch. I took the lead, with Max right behind me. Linda brought up the rear, with Emily between us. We'd been walking for maybe an hour when we heard it, a low, menacing growl from the bushes to our right. I froze, my arm outstretched to stop Max. Slowly, I turned my head. There, half hidden in the shadows, I saw a pair of eyes reflecting the morning light. They were too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal, and they gleamed with an intelligence that made my blood run cold. "Run!" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Now!" We took off down the trail, all attempts at stealth forgotten. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush behind us, their howls filling the air. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in our panic, but suddenly, miraculously, we burst out onto a paved road. An old pickup truck was approaching, and I've never been so glad to see another human being in my life. The driver, an elderly man with a weathered face, took one look at our terrified expressions and screeching to a halt. "Get in!" he yelled, and we didn't need to be told twice. As we sped away, I looked back. For a split second, I saw them at the edge of the trees, tall, fur-covered figures that stood upright like men, but moved with an animal's grace. Then they melted back into the forest, and I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. We never went back for our car or the rest of our gear. The old man drove us straight to the nearest town, where we called the police. They searched the area but found nothing out of the ordinary, just an abandoned campsite and a car with some animal scratches. We told our story, but I could see the disbelief in their eyes. They chalked it up to an encounter with some aggressive bears, maybe exaggerated by fear and exhaustion. But we know what we saw, what we heard, what we felt. We don't go camping anymore. How could we, knowing what's out there in the wild places of the world? Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those howls in my dreams. I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, half expecting to see glowing eyes peering in through our bedroom window. So let this be a warning to all you campers and nature enthusiasts out there. Stick to the popular sites, the well-traveled paths, because sometimes, when you venture too far into the wilderness, you find things that were never meant to be found. And sometimes, the most terrifying thing isn't what you can see, it's what you can't. The shapes in the shadows, the eyes in the darkness, the howls in the night. The knowledge that out there, beyond the comforting glow of your campfire, something is watching, waiting, and maybe, just maybe, hunting. Story 21. They say knowledge is power, but sometimes knowing too much can be a curse, especially when what you know shouldn't exist. My name is Lisa Chen, and I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in bear behavior. For years, I've tracked and studied black bears in the Cascade Mountains, documenting their habits and movements. I thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand, but last summer, I discovered how wrong I was. It started as a routine research trip. I was setting up trail cameras to monitor a particularly active bear corridor. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, a light breeze, and the forest alive with the sounds of birds and small animals. I should have known it was too good to last. I was checking the footage on one of my cameras when I first noticed something odd. The bears I'd been tracking were behaving strangely, avoiding areas they'd previously frequented. At first, I chalked it up to natural variations in behavior, but as I reviewed more footage, a pattern emerged. The bears were scared of something. Intrigued, I decided to investigate further. I hiked deeper into the forest, following the bears' new routes. That's when I found it, the carcass that would change everything. It was an elk, or what was left of one. But this was no ordinary kill. The carcass had been torn apart with savage force, far beyond what a bear or even a pack of wolves could do. Long, deep claw marks scored the nearby trees, higher up than any bear could reach. And the smell. It was like nothing I'd ever encountered before, a mix of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else I couldn't identify. My scientific curiosity overrode my growing sense of unease. I set up a new camera facing the carcass, determined to capture whatever had done this. Looking back, I wish I'd listened to the voice in my head screaming at me to leave. I spent the next few days checking my cameras and collecting data. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet. No birdsong, no scurrying of small animals. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. On the third night, a storm rolled in. Rain lashed against my tent as thunder boomed overhead. I was reviewing the day's footage on my laptop when the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Even over the storm, I could hear something moving outside, something big. I switched off my light and peered out through a small gap in the tent flap. What I saw in the brief flashes of lightning made my blood run cold. It was tall, far taller than a man, and covered in thick, matted fur. Its proportions were all wrong, with arms that hung below its knees and a head that seemed to sit directly on its shoulders. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me, glowing an eerie yellow-green in the darkness, filled with an intelligence that was decidedly not animal. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't notice me. For what felt like hours, it prowled around my campsite, sniffing the air and letting out low, rumbling growls. Finally, mercifully, it loped off into the forest. I didn't sleep a wink that night. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, I rushed to check my cameras. Most of them had been destroyed, torn apart by powerful claws. But one had survived, and what it captured haunts me to this day. The creature was clearly visible, its massive form unmistakable even in the grainy night vision footage. It moved with a fluid grace that belied its size, more like a predatory cat than an ape. And then it looked directly at the camera, its eyes seeming to stare right through the lens. In that moment, I knew it was aware of being watched, and it didn't like it. I should have left right then. Should have hiked out and never looked back, but the scientist in me, the part that always hungered for discovery, convinced me to stay. Just one more day, I told myself, one more chance to gather data on this impossible creature. That decision nearly cost me my life. As night fell, the storm returned with a vengeance. I huddled in my tent, every sense on high alert. The creature's screech cut through the howling wind, closer than ever before. I could hear it circling my tent, its heavy breathing audible even over the rain. Suddenly, my radio crackled to life. Lisa, do you copy? There's a severe weather warning for your area. You need to evacuate immediately. The creature's roar drowned out the rest of the message. In a panic, I grabbed my emergency pack and burst out of the tent. I caught a glimpse of yellow-green eyes and matted fur before I took off running. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face as I desperately tried to remember the way back to the trail. The creature's roars echoed through the forest, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind. It was toying with me, I realized with growing horror, herding me. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that green hell of rain and terror. But suddenly, the trees thinned out, and I found myself on the edge of a cliff. Far below, I could see the lights of the ranger station. Safety was so close, yet impossibly far. A low growl behind me made my heart stop. I turned slowly, already knowing what I'd see. The creature stood at the edge of the tree line, its massive form silhouetted against the storm-dark sky. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I was struck again by the intelligence in its eyes. This was no mere animal. It knew exactly what it was doing. It took a step forward, and I stumbled back, my heel meeting empty air. I was out of options. It was the cliff or the creature. Lightning flashed, illuminating the forest, and in that brief, brilliant moment, I saw something that shook me to my core. Behind the creature, half hidden in the shadows, were others, smaller, but unmistakably the same species, a family group. In that instant, I understood. It hadn't been hunting me, not really. It had been protecting its young, driving away a perceived threat, and I had blundered right into its territory. As the realization hit me, the creature's posture changed. The aggression seemed to drain out of it. It tilted its head, regarding me with what I could swear was curiosity. Then, slowly, deliberately, it turned and melted back into the forest, taking its family with it. I collapsed to the ground, my legs no longer able to support me. I don't know how long I sat there in the rain, trying to process what had happened. Eventually, a search and rescue team found me, alerted by my missed check-ins. I never told them the full story. How could I? They'd think I was crazy. I reported an encounter with an unusually aggressive bear, nothing more. But I knew the truth. In the years since that night, I've pored over my remaining footage, cross-referencing it with folklore and cryptozoology. I found mentions of similar creatures in Native American legends, stories of wild men in pioneer journals. Always on the fringes of human habitation, always just out of sight, I still work as a wildlife biologist. But I've shifted my focus away from bears. I can't bring myself to go back into those deep forests, because I know now that we don't know everything about this world. There are creatures out there that defy explanation, beings that blur the line between animal and something else. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that roar in my dreams. I wake up in a cold sweat, half expecting to see yellow-green eyes peering in through my window, and I wonder how many other hikers, campers, and researchers have encountered these creatures. How many weren't as lucky as I was? So let this be a warning to all you nature enthusiasts and budding scientists out there. The wilderness holds secrets, mysteries that may be better left undiscovered, because sometimes when you go looking for knowledge, you find more than you bargained for, and not all discoveries are meant to be shared with the world. Remember, in the deepest parts of the forest, where the shadows grow thick and the silence becomes oppressive, you are not alone. You are not the apex predator, and you are always, always being watched. Story 22. They say the thrill of the hunt is in the chase, but what happens when you realize you're not the hunter anymore? My name is Jake Hawkins, and I've been a hunting guide in the Appalachian Mountains for over 2 decades. I thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand, every trail, every hollow, every ridge. But last fall, I learned just how wrong I was. It was supposed to be a routine expedition, just me and 2 clients, Tom and Mike, out for a week-long deer hunting trip. We'd picked a remote area, deep in the heart of the mountains, where the bucks grew big and the hunting pressure was low. I should have known better than to venture that far off the beaten path. The first 2 days were uneventful. We tracked deer, set up blinds, and swapped stories around the campfire at night. Tom and Mike were good guys, experienced hunters who knew how to move quietly and respect the wilderness. I was enjoying their company and the crisp autumn air. On the 3rd morning, we set out before dawn, hoping to catch the deer in their early feeding patterns. The forest was shrouded in mist, the trees looming like silent sentinels in the pre-dawn gloom. Something felt off from the start, though I couldn't put my finger on what. It wasn't until we reached our first planned stop that I realized what was bothering me. The forest was too quiet, no birds singing, no squirrels chattering, not even the buzz of insects. It was as if the entire woodland had collectively held its breath. "Jake," Tom whispered, his eyes scanning the underbrush, "where are all the animals?" I shook my head, unease growing in the pit of my stomach. Not sure. Maybe a predator passed through recently. Let's keep moving. We pressed on, following a deer trail I'd scouted earlier in the week. That's when we found the first sign that something was very, very wrong. It was a deer, all right, or what was left of one. The carcass had been torn apart with savage force, far beyond what a bear or even a pack of wolves could do. Long, deep claw marks scored the nearby trees, higher up than any animal I knew could reach. Mike knelt down to examine the kill. "Jake, what could have done this?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words died in my throat as I saw what he was pointing at. There, in the soft earth beside the carcass, was a footprint. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot, and it looked almost human. But the toes ended in clear claw marks, and the shape was all wrong, more elongated and primitive. A twig snapped in the forest behind us, and we all whirled around, rifles at the ready. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something large moving through the trees, a flash of dark fur and the gleam of eyes that were far too intelligent to belong to any animal. "Back to camp," I said, my voice low and urgent. "Now!" We moved as quickly and quietly as we could, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, followed. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow seemed to hide potential danger. We were about halfway back to our campsite when we heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite human, and it sent a chill down my spine. "Run!" I yelled, abandoning all pretense of stealth. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces as we ran. I could hear something large moving through the forest behind us, keeping pace effortlessly. The growls grew louder, joined by others. There was more than one of them, and they were herding us. We burst into a small clearing, and for a moment I thought we might make it. Then I saw them. They emerged from the trees like living shadows, massive forms covered in thick matted fur. They stood upright like men, but their proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, shoulders too broad, heads that seemed to sit directly on their chests. But it was their eyes that truly terrified me, glowing with an intelligence that was decidedly not animal, filled with a predatory hunger that made my blood run cold. We stood frozen, our rifles feeling woefully inadequate against these monsters. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then one of the creatures let out a roar that shook the very air around us, and chaos erupted. I fired my rifle, the sound deafening in the small clearing. I saw my shot hit one of the creatures in the shoulder, but it barely seemed to notice. These things, whatever they were tough. The trees... I yelled to Tom and Mike, "Climb!" We scrambled up the nearest pines, the rough bark tearing at our hands as we climbed. I reached a sturdy branch about 20 feet up and turned to help Tom, who was right behind me. But Mike wasn't so lucky. One of the creatures caught him just as he was starting to climb. I'll never forget the sound of Mike's scream as it pulled him down, or the sickening crunch that followed. I closed my eyes, unable to watch what happened next. When I opened them again, Mike was gone, and the creatures were circling the base of our trees, growling and snapping. They could have easily climbed up after us. I could see the power in their limbs. But for some reason, they didn't. It was almost as if they were playing with us. Hours passed. The creatures never left, never seemed to tire. They paced around the trees, occasionally reaching up to swipe at our dangling feet. Tom and I clung to our branches, too terrified to speak, watching as the sun slowly sank towards the horizon. As night fell, a new sound joined the creatures. Growls, a high-pitched, keening wail that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was answered by similar cries from deeper in the forest. More were coming. "We have to move," I whispered to Tom. "There's a ranger station about 5 miles east of here. If we can make it there." Tom nodded, his face pale in the fading light. How? I pointed to the next tree over, its branches intertwined with ours. We go tree to tree, stay as quiet as possible. It was slow, terrifying work. We inched along branches, leapt across gaps, always aware of the creatures prowling below. Sometimes we'd lose sight of them in the darkness, only to hear a growl directly beneath us that sent our hearts racing. We'd gone maybe half a mile when disaster struck. Tom was reaching for the next branch when it snapped under his weight. He fell, his scream piercing the night air. I reached for him, our fingers brushing for a split second before he disappeared into the darkness below. The creature's roars of triumph drowned out the sound of Tom's landing. I clung to my branch, shaking, as I heard the sounds of a brief struggle followed by silence. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I moved on autopilot, driven by pure survival instinct. Somehow, I made it to the ranger station just as dawn was breaking. I burst through the door, babbling about monsters in the woods. The rangers, seeing my torn clothes and wild eyes, assumed I'd had an encounter with a bear. They sent out search parties for Tom and Mike, but found nothing. No bodies, no signs of a struggle, not even our campsite. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. I never went back to those mountains. How could I, knowing what was out there? I left my job as a hunting guide and moved to the city where the only predators are human. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those growls in my dreams. I wake up in a cold sweat, half expecting to see glowing eyes peering in through my window. And I wonder how many other hunters have encountered these creatures, how many didn't live to tell the tale. So let this be a warning to all you hunters and outdoor enthusiasts. The wilderness holds secrets, dangers that go beyond what we know, because sometimes, when you go into the forest looking for prey, you find out too late that you're the one being hunted. And in the deepest, darkest parts of the woods, where the shadows grow thick and the silence becomes oppressive, remember, you are not alone. You are not the apex predator, and something ancient and hungry is always, always watching. Story 23. They say heroes run towards danger when everyone else runs away. But what happens when the danger is beyond anything you've been trained for? My name is Sarah Reeves, and I've been part of the mountain rescue team in the Rockies for 6 years. I thought I'd seen it all: lost hikers, injured climbers, even the occasional bear encounter. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened last summer when we went searching for a missing hiker. It started as a routine call. A solo hiker, Mark Stevens, hadn't checked in with his family for 3 days. His last known location was near Timber Creek, a remote area popular with experienced backpackers. Our team of 4, myself, Jake, Lisa, and our team leader, Tom, set out at dawn, confident we'd find Mark and have him safely back by nightfall. The weather was perfect as we began our search. Clear skies, a light breeze, and the forest alive with the sounds of birds and small animals. We split into 2 teams, with Jake and I taking the northern section while Lisa and Tom covered the south. Jake and I had been searching for about 3 hours when we found the first sign of Mark. His backpack was lying at the base of a large pine tree, its contents strewn across the forest floor. What caught my attention wasn't the scattered gear, but the state of the backpack itself. It looked like it had been torn apart by something with incredible strength and very large claws. "Bear," Jake suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. We both knew bear attacks were rare, and this didn't fit the usual pattern. I keyed my radio to update Tom and Lisa, but all I got was static. We were in a dead zone, which wasn't uncommon in these mountains. Still, a feeling of unease settled in the pit of my stomach. As we continued our search, the forest around us grew unnaturally quiet. The birdsong ceased, and even the wind seemed to die down, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified in the silence. We found Mark's torn sleeping bag about a half-mile from his backpack. Nearby, scored deep into the trunk of a massive oak, were 3 parallel claw marks, higher up than any bear could reach. A sickly, sweet odor hung in the air, like rotting meat mixed with wet dog. "Sarah," Jake whispered, his face pale, "what the hell are we dealing with here?" Before I could answer, a scream shattered the silence. It came from the south, where Tom and Lisa were searching. It wasn't the cry of someone in pain or fear, but something more primal, more inhuman. We took off running towards the sound, all thoughts of stealth forgotten. As we crashed through the underbrush, I caught glimpses of movement in the trees around us. Large, dark shapes flitting between the trunks, always just at the edge of my vision. We burst into a small clearing and froze at the sight before us. Lisa was there, crouched over Tom's motionless form. But it wasn't Lisa's sobbing that made my blood run cold. It was the massive, fur-covered creatures surrounding them. They were tall, at least 8 feet, with powerfully built bodies covered in thick, matted fur. Their faces were a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with deep-set eyes that glowed with an unsettling intelligence. As we entered the clearing, they turned as one to look at us, and I felt the weight of their gaze like a physical force. For a moment, nobody moved. Then one of the creatures let out a bone-chilling roar, and all hell broke loose. Jake opened fire with his rifle, the sound deafening in the small clearing. I saw his shots hit one of the creatures, but it barely seemed to notice. These things, whatever they were incredibly tough. "Lisa, run!" I screamed, firing my own weapon to give her cover. Lisa scrambled to her feet and ran towards us, leaving Tom behind. I felt a pang of guilt at abandoning him, but one look told me he was beyond help. We had to focus on the living now. As Lisa reached us, I grabbed her arm and yelled, "Into the trees, climb!" We scrambled up the nearest pines, the rough bark tearing at our hands as we climbed. I reached a sturdy branch about 20 feet up and turned to help Lisa, who was right behind me. But Jake wasn't so lucky. One of the creatures caught him just as he was starting to climb. I'll never forget the sound of Jake's scream as it pulled him down, or the sickening crunch that followed. I closed my eyes, unable to watch what happened next. When I opened them again, Jake was gone, and the creatures were circling the base of our trees, growling and snapping. They could have easily climbed up after us. I could see the power in their limbs, but for some reason they didn't. It was almost as if they were toying with us. Lisa clung to me, sobbing quietly. I held her close, my mind racing. What were these things? Where had they come from? And most importantly, how were we going to get out of this alive? Hours passed. The creatures never left, never seemed to tire. They paced around the trees, occasionally reaching up to swipe at our dangling feet. Lisa and I clung to our branches, too terrified to speak, watching as the sun slowly sank towards the horizon. As night fell, a new sound joined the creatures. Growls, a high-pitched, keening wail that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was answered by similar cries from deeper in the forest. More were coming. "We have to move," I whispered to Lisa. "There's a ranger station about 3 miles southeast of here. If we can make it there—" Lisa nodded, her face pale in the fading light. "How?" I pointed to the next tree over, its branches intertwined with ours. "We go tree to tree, stay as quiet as possible." It was slow, terrifying work. We inched along branches, leapt across gaps, always aware of the creatures prowling below. Sometimes we'd lose sight of them in the darkness, only to hear a growl directly beneath us that sent our hearts racing. We'd gone maybe a mile when disaster struck. Lisa was reaching for the next branch when it snapped under her weight. She fell, her scream piercing the night air. I reached for her, our fingers brushing for a split second before she disappeared into the darkness below. The creature's roars of triumph drowned out the sound of Lisa's landing. I clung to my branch, shaking, as I heard the sounds of a brief struggle followed by silence. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I moved on autopilot, driven by pure survival instinct. Somehow, I made it to the ranger station just as dawn was breaking. I burst through the door, babbling about monsters in the woods. The rangers, seeing my torn clothes and wild eyes, assumed I'd had an encounter with a bear. They sent out search parties for my team and Mark, but found nothing. No bodies, no signs of a struggle, not even the clearing where we'd last seen Tom. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. I never went back to mountain rescue after that. How could I, knowing what was out there? I left the mountains entirely, moving to a bustling city where the only predators were human. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those growls in my dreams. I wake up in a cold sweat, half expecting to see glowing eyes peering in through my window. And I wonder, how many other rescuers have encountered these creatures? How many didn't live to tell the tale? So let this be a warning to all you brave souls who run towards danger. The wilderness holds secrets, terrors that go beyond what we're trained for. Because sometimes, when you go into the forest to save someone else, you find out too late that you're the one who needs saving. And in the deepest, darkest parts of the woods, where the shadows grow thick and the silence becomes oppressive, remember, you are not alone. You are not the savior, and something ancient and hungry is always watching.